11 Swords of the South. Dawn that rose over the distant hills shone on the sails of a small craft that dropped down the river, which curves to within a mile of the walls of Turanshia, and loops southward like a great shining serpent. This boat differed from the ordinary craft plying the broad Kahorotas, fishermen and merchant barges loaded with rich goods. It was long and slender, with a high, curving prow, and was black as ebony, with white skulls painted along the gunwales. Amidships rose a small cabin, the windows closely masked. Other craft gave the ominously painted boat a wide berth, for it was obviously one of those pilgrim boats that carried a lifeless follower of Asura on his last mysterious pilgrimage southward to where, far beyond the Poitanian mountains, a river flowed at last into the blue ocean. In that cabin undoubtedly lay the corpse of the departed worshipper. All men were familiar with the sight of those gloomy craft, and the most fanatical votary of Mitra would not dare touch or interfere with their somber voyages. Where the ultimate destination lay, men did not know. Some said Stygia, some a nameless island lying beyond the horizon, others said it was in the glamorous and mysterious land of Ventoye where the dead came home at last. But none knew certainly. They only knew that when a follower of Asura died, the corpse went southward down the great river, in a black boat rowed by a giant slave, and neither boat nor corpse nor slave was ever seen again, unless, indeed, certain dark tales were true, and it was always the same slave who rowed the boats southward. The man who propelled this panicular boat was as huge and brown as the others, though closer scrutiny might have revealed the fact that the hue was the result of carefully applied pigments. He was clad in leather loincloth and sandals, and he handled the long sweep and oars with unusual skill and power. But none approached the grim boat closely, for it was well known that the followers of Asura were accursed, and that these pilgrim boats were loaded with dark magic. So men swung their boats wide and muttered an incantation as the dark craft slid past, and they never dreamed that they were thus assisting in the flight of their king and the Countess Albiona. It was a strange journey, in that black, slim craft down the great river for nearly 200 miles to where the Kahorotas swings eastward, skirting the Poitanian mountains. Like a dream the ever-changing panorama glided past. During the day Albiona lay patiently in the little cabin, as quietly as the corpse she pretended to be. Only late at night, after the pleasure boats with their fair occupants lounging on silken cushions in the flare of torches, held by slaves, had left the river, before dawn brought the hurrying fisher boats, did the girl venture out. Then she held the long sweep, cunningly bound in place by ropes to aid her, while Conan snatched a few hours of sleep. But the king needed little rest. The fire of his desire drove him relentlessly, and his powerful frame was equal to the grinding test. Without halt or pause they drove southward. So down the river they fled, through nights when the flowing current mirrored the million stars, and through days of golden sunlight, leaving winter behind them as they sped southward. They passed cities in the night, above which throbbed and pulsed the reflection of the myriad lights, lordly river villas and fertile groves. So at last the blue mountains of Poitine rose above them, tier above tier, like ramparts of the gods, and the great river, swerving from those turreted cliffs, swept thunderously through the marching hills, with many a rapid and foaming cataract. Conan scanned the shoreline closely, and finally swung the long sweep, and headed inshore at a point where a neck of land jutted into the water, and fir trees grew in a curiously symmetrical ring about a grey, strangely shaped rock. How these boats ride those falls we hear roaring ahead of us is more than I can see, he grunted. Hadrathas said they did, but here's where we halt. He said a man would be waiting for us with horses, but I don't see anyone. How word of our coming could have preceded us I don't know anyway. He drove inshore and bound the prow to an arching root in the low bank, and then, plunging into the water, washed the brown paint from his skin, and emerged dripping, and in his natural color. From the cabin he brought forth a suit of Aquilonian ringmail which Hadrathas had procured for him, and his sword. These he donned while Albiona put on garments suitable for mountain travel. and when Conan was fully armed, and turned to look toward the shore, he started and his hand went to his sword. For on the shore, under the trees, stood a black-cloaked figure holding the reins of a white palfrey and a bay war horse. "Who are you?" demanded the king. The other bowed low. "A follower of Asura." A command came. I obeyed. "How came?" inquired Conan, but the other merely bowed again. "I have come to guide you through the mountains to the first Poitanian stronghold." "I don't need a guide," answered Conan. "I know these hills well. I thank you for the horses, but the Countess and I will attract less attention alone than if we were accompanied by an acolyte of Asura." The man bowed profoundly, and giving the reins into Conan's hands, stepped into the boat. Casting off, he floated down the swift current, toward the distant roar of the unseen rapids. With a baffled shake of his head, Conan lifted the Countess into the palfrey's saddle, and then mounted the war horse and reined toward the summits that castellated the sky. The rolling country at the foot of the towering mountains was now a borderland, in a state of turmoil, where the barons reverted to feudal practices, and bands of outlaws roamed unhindered. Poitine had not formally declared her separation from Aquilonia, but she was now, to all intents, a self-contained kingdom, ruled by her hereditary count, Trusero. The rolling south country had submitted nominally to Valorous, but he had not attempted to force the passes guarded by strongholds where the crimson leopard banner of Poitine waved defiantly. The king and his fair companion rode up the long blue slopes in the soft evening. As they mounted higher, the rolling country spread out like a vast purple mantle far beneath them, shot with the shine of rivers and lakes, the yellow glint of broad fields, and the white gleam of distant towers. Ahead of them and far above, they glimpsed the first of the Poitanian holds, a strong fortress dominating a narrow pass, the crimson banner streaming against the clear blue sky. Before they reached it, a band of knights in burnished armor rode from among the trees, and their leader sternly ordered the travelers to halt. They were tall men, with the dark eyes and raven locks of the south. "Halt, sir, and state your business, and why you ride toward Poitine." "Is Poitine in revolt then?" asked Conan, watching the other closely, that a man in Aquilonian harness is halted and questioned like a foreigner. "Many rogues ride out of Aquilonia these days," answered the other coldly. "As for revolt, if you mean the repudiation of a usurper, then Poitine is in revolt. We had rather serve the memory of a dead man than the scepter of a living dog." Conan swept off his helmet, and shaking back his black mane, stared full at the speaker. The Poitanian stared violently and went livid. "Saints of heaven," he gasped. "It is the king, alive!" The others stared wildly, then a roar of wonder and joy burst from them. They swarmed about Conan, shouting their war cries and brandishing their swords in their extreme emotion. The acclaim of Poitanian warriors was a thing to Tenedollar, a timid man. 011, "But Trusero will weep tears of joy to see you, sire," cried one. "Aye, and Prospero," shouted another. "The general has been like one wrapped in a mantle of melancholy, and curses himself night and day that he did not reach the Valkyr in time to die beside his king." "Now we will strike for Empery," yelled another, whirling his great sword about his head. "Hail, Conan, king of Poitine!" The clangor of bright steel about him and the thunder of their acclaim frightened the birds that rose in gay-hued clouds from the surrounding trees. The hot southern blood was afire, and they desired nothing but for their newfound sovereign to lead them to battle and pillage. "What is your command, sire?" they cried. "Let one of us ride ahead and bear the news of your coming into Poitine. Banners will wave from every tower, roses will carpet the road before your horses' feet, and all the beauty and chivalry of the south will give you the honor due you." Conan shook his head. "Who could doubt your loyalty? But winds blow over these mountains into the countries of my enemies, and I would rather these didn't know that I lived, yet. Take me to Trusero, and keep my identity a secret." So what the knights would have made a triumphal procession was more in the nature of a secret flight. They travelled in haste, speaking to no one, except for a whisper to the captain on duty at each pass, and Conan rode among them with his visor lowered. The mountains were uninhabited save by outlaws and garrisons of soldiers who guarded the passes. The pleasure-loving Poitanians had no need nor desire to wrest a hard and scanty living from their stern breasts. South of the ranges the rich and beautiful plains of Poitain stretched to the river Alimain, but beyond the river lay the land of Zingara. Even now, when winter was crisping the leaves beyond the mountains, the tall rich grass waved upon the plains where grazed the horses and cattle for which Poitain was famed. Palm trees and orange groves smiled in the sun, and the gorgeous purple and gold and crimson towers of castles and cities reflected the golden light. It was a land of warmth and plenty, of beautiful men and ferocious warriors. It is not only the hard lands that breed hard men. Poitain was surrounded by covetous neighbors, and her sons learned hardihood in incessant wars. To the north the land was guarded by the mountains, but to the south only the Alimain separated the plains of Poitain from the plains of Zingara, and not once but 1,000 times had that river run red. To the east lay Argos, and beyond that Offa, proud kingdoms and avaricious. The knights of Poitain held their lands by the weight and edge of their swords, and little of ease and idleness they knew. So Conan came presently to the castle of Count Trusero. Conan sat on a silken divan in a rich chamber, whose filmy curtains the warm breeze billowed. Trusero paced the floor like a panther, a lithe, restless man with the waist of a woman and the shoulders of a swordsman, who carried his years lightly. "Let us proclaim you king of Poitain," urged the count. "Let those non-hem pigs wear the yoke to which they have bent their necks. The south is still yours. Dwell here and nlle us, amid the flowers and the palms." But Conan shook his head. "There is no nobler land on earth than Poitain. But it cannot stand alone, bold as are its sons." "It did stand alone for generations," retorted Trusero, with the quick jealous pride of his breed. "We were not always a part of Aquilonia. I know. But conditions are not as they were then, when all kingdoms were broken into principalities which warred with each other. The days of dukedoms and free cities are past, the days of empires are upon us. Rulers are dreaming imperial dreams, and only in unity is their strength." "Then let us unite Zingara with Poitain," argued Trusero. "Half a dozen princes strive against each other, and the country is torn asunder by civil wars. We will conquer it, province by province, and add it to your dominions. Then with the aid of the Zingarans we will conquer Argos and Offa. We will build an empire." Again Conan shook his head. "Let others dream imperial dreams. I but wish to hold what is mine. I have no desire to rule an empire welded together by blood and fire. It's one thing to seize a throne with the aid of its subjects, and rule them with their consent. It's another to subjugate a foreign realm, and rule it by fear. I don't wish to be another Valorous. No, Trusero, I'll rule all Aquilonia, and no more, or I'll rule nothing. Then lead us over the mountains, and we will smite the Numidians." Conan's fierce eyes glowed with appreciation. "No, Trusero. It would be a vain sacrifice. I've told you what I must do to regain my kingdom. I must find the heart of Ahriman." "But this is madness," protested Trusero, "the maunderings of a heretical priest, the mumblings of a mad witch woman." "You were not in my tent before Valkyr," answered Conan grimly, involuntarily glancing at his right wrist, on which blue marks still showed faintly. "You didn't see the cliffs thundered down to crush the flower of my army." "No, Trusero, I've been convinced. Xultotun's no mortal man, and only with the heart of Ahriman can I stand against him. So I'm riding to Cadaver, alone." "But that is dangerous," protested Trusero. "Life is dangerous," rumbled the king. "El won't go as king of Aquilonia, or even as a knight of Poitain, but as a wandering mercenary, as I rode in Zingara in the old days. Oh, I have enemies enough south of the Alamein, in the lands and the waters of the south. Many who won't know me as King of Aquilonia will remember me as Conan of the Barachan Pirates, or Amra of the Black Corsairs. But I have friends, too, and men who'll aid me for their own private reasons. A faintly reminiscent grin touched his lips. Trusero dropped his hands helplessly and glanced at Albiona, who sat on a nearby divan. I understand your doubts, my lord, said she. But I too saw the coin in the temple of Asura, and look you, Hadrathas said it was dated 500 years before the fall of Icheran. If Xototun, then, is the man pictured on the coin, as his majesty swears he is, that means he was no common wizard, even in his other life, for the years of his life were numbered by centuries, not as the lives of other men are numbered. Before Trusero could reply, a respectful rap was heard on the door, and a voice called, "My lord, we have caught a man skulking about the castle, who says he wishes to speak with your guest." "I await your orders." A spy from Aquilonia, hissed Trusero, catching at his dagger, but Conan lifted his voice and called, "Open the door and let me see him." The door was opened and a man was framed in it, grasped on either hand by stem-looking men-at-arms. He was a slender man, clad in a dark hooded robe. "Are you a follower of Asura?" asked Conan. The man nodded, and the stalwart men-at-arms looked shocked and glanced hesitantly at Trusero. "The word came southward," said the man. "Beyond the Alamein we cannot aid you, for our sect goes no farther southward, but stretches eastward with the Khorotas. But this I have learned, the thief who took the heart of Ahriman from Tarascus never reached Kadava. In the mountains of Poitine he was slain by robbers. The jewel fell into the hands of their chief, who, not knowing its UUE nature, and being harried after the destruction of his band by Poitanian knights, sold it to the Gothic merchant Zarathus." "Ha!" Conan was on his feet, galvanized. "And what of Zarathus?" 4 days ago he crossed the Alamein, headed for Argos, with a small band of armed servants. "He's a fool to cross Zingara in such times," said Trusero. "Aye, times are troublous across the river. But Zarathus is a bold man, and reckless in his way. He is in great haste to reach Messenciar, where he hopes to find a buyer for the jewel. Perhaps he hopes to sell it finally in Stygia. Perhaps he guesses at its TNLE nature. At any rate, instead of following the long road that winds along the borders of Poitine, and so at last comes into Argos far from Messenciar, he has struck straight across eastern Zingara, following the shorter and more direct route." Conan smote the table with his clenched fist so that the great board quivered. "Then, by Kron, fortune has at last thrown the dice for me. A horse, Trusero, and the harness of a free companion. Zarathus has a long start, but not too long for me to overtake him, if I follow him to the end of the world." 12. The Fang of the Dragon. At dawn Conan waded his horse across the shallows of the Alamein and struck the wide caravan trail, which ran southeastward, and behind him, on the farther bank, Trusero sat his horse silently at the head of his steel-clad knights, with the crimson leopard of Poitine floating its long folds over him in the morning breeze. Silently they sat, those dark-haired men in shining steel, until the figure of their king had vanished in the blue of distance that whitened toward sunrise. Conan rode a great black stallion, the gift of Trusero. He no longer wore the armor of Aquilonia. His harness proclaimed him a veteran of the free companies, who were of all races. His headpiece was a plain morion, dented and battered. The leather and mail mesh of his hauberk were worn and shiny as if by many campaigns, and the scarlet cloak flowing carelessly from his mailed shoulders was tattered and stained. He looked the part of the hired fighting man, who had known all vicissitudes of fortune, plunder and wealth one day, an empty purse and a close-drawn belt the next. And more than looking the part, he felt the part, the awakening of old memories, The resurge of the wild, mad, glorious days of old before his feet was set on the imperial path, when he was a wandering mercenary, roistering, brawling, guzzling, adventuring, with no thought for the morrow, and no desire save sparkling ale, red lips, and a keen sword to swing on all the battlefields of the world. Unconsciously he reverted to the old ways, a new swagger became evident in his bearing, in the way he sat his horse, half-forgotten oaths rose naturally to his lips, and as he rode he hummed old songs that he had roared in chorus with his reckless companions in many a tavern and on many a dusty road or bloody field. It was an unquiet land through which he rode. The companies of cavalry which usually patrolled the river, alert for raids out of Poityne, were nowhere in evidence. Internal strife had left the borders unguarded. The long white road stretched bare from horizon to horizon. No laden camel trains or rumbling wagons or lowing herds moved along it now, only occasional groups of horsemen in leather and steel, hawk-faced, hard-eyed men, who kept together and rode warily. These swept Conan with their searching gaze but rode on, for the solitary rider's harness promised no plunder, but only hard strokes. Villages lay in ashes and deserted, the fields and meadows idle. Only the boldest would ride the roads these days, and the native population had been decimated in the civil wars, and by raids from across the river. In more peaceful times the road was thronged with merchants riding Poityne to Messencyr in Argos, or back. But now these found it wiser to follow the road that led east through Poityne, and then turned south down across Argos. It was longer, but safer. Only an extremely reckless man would risk his life and goods on this road through Zingara. The southern horizon was fringed with flame by night, and in the day straggling pillars of smoke drifted upward. In the cities and plains to the south men were dying, thrones were toppling and castles going up in flames. Conan felt the old tug of the professional fighting man, to turn his horse and plunge into the fighting, the pillaging and the looting as in the days of old. Why should he toil to regain the NLLE of a people which had already forgotten him? Why chase a will-o'-the-wisp? Why pursue a crown that was lost forever? Why should he not seek forgetfulness, lose himself in the red tides of war and rapine that had engulfed him so often before? Could he not, indeed, carve out another kingdom for himself? The world was entering an age of iron, an age of war and imperialistic ambition. Some strong man might well rise above the lines of nations as a supreme conqueror. Why should it not be himself? So his familiar devil whispered in his ear, and the phantoms of his lawless and bloody past crowded upon him. But he did not turn aside, he rode onward, following a quest that grew dimmer and dimmer as he advanced, until sometimes it seemed that he pursued a dream that never was. He pushed the black stallion as hard as he dared, but the long white road lay bare before him, from horizon to horizon. It was a long start Zarathus had, but Conan rode steadily on, knowing that he was traveling faster than the burdened merchants could travel. And so he came to the castle of Count Valbroso, perched like a vulture's eyrie on a bare hill overlooking the road. Valbroso rode down with his men-at-arms, a lean, dark man with glittering eyes, and a predatory beak of a nose. He wore black plate armor and was followed by thilty spearmen, black-mustached hawks of the border wars, as avaricious and ruthless as himself. Of late the toll of the caravans had been slim, and Valbroso cursed the civil wars that stripped the roads of their fat traffic, even while he blessed them for the free hand they allowed him with his neighbors. He had not hoped much from the solitary rider he had glimpsed from his tower, but all was grist that came to his mill. With a practiced eye he took in Conan's worn mail and dark, scarred face, and his conclusions were the same as those of the riders who had passed the Cimmerian on the road, an empty purse and a ready blade. "Who are you, knave?" he demanded. "A mercenary, riding for Argos," answered Conan. "What matter names? You are riding in the wrong direction for a free companion," muttered Valbroso. "Southward the fighting is good and also the plundering. Join my company. You won't go hungry. The road remains bare of fat merchants to strip, but I mean to take my rogues, and fare southward to sell our swords to whichever side seems strongest." Conan did not at once reply, knowing that if he refused outright, he might be instantly attacked by Valbroso's men-at-arms. Before he could make up his mind, the Singaran spoke again. "You rogues of the free companies always know tricks to make men talk. I have a prisoner, the last merchant I caught, by Mitra, and the only one I've seen for a week, and the knave is stubborn. He has an iron box, the secret of which defies us, and I've been unable to persuade him to open it. By Ishtar, I thought I knew all the modes of persuasion there are, but perhaps Yao, as a veteran free companion, knows some that I do not. At any rate, come with me and see what you may do." Valbroso's words instantly decided Conan. That sounded a great deal like Zarathus. Conan did not know the merchant, but any man who was stubborn enough to try to traverse the Singaran road in times like these would very probably be stubborn enough to defer torture. He fell in beside Valbroso, and rode up the straggling road to the top of the hill where the gaunt castle stood. As a man-at-arms he should have ridden behind the count, but force of habit made him careless, and Valbroso paid no heed. Years of life on the border had taught the count that the frontier is not the royal court. He was aware of the independence of the mercenaries, behind whose swords many a king had trodden the throne path. There was a dry moat, half filled with debris in some places. They clattered across the drawbridge, and through the arch of the gate. Behind them the portcullis fell with a sullen clang. They came into a bare courtyard, grown with straggling grass, and with a well in the middle. Shacks for the men-at-arms straggled about the bailey wall, and women, slatternly or decked in gaudy finery, looked from the doors. Fighting men in rusty mail tossed dice on the flags under the arches. It was more like a bandit's hold than the castle of a nobleman. Valbroso dismounted and motioned Conan to follow him. They went through a doorway and along a vaulted corridor, where they were met by a scarred, hard-looking man in mail descending a stone staircase, evidently the captain of the guard. "How, Belosso," quoth Valbroso, "has he spoken?" "He is stubborn," muttered Belosso, shooting a glance of suspicion at Conan. Valbroso ripped out an oath, and stamped furiously up the winding stair, followed by Conan and the captain. As they mounted, the groans of a man in mortal agony became audible. Valbroso's torture room was high above the court, instead of in a dungeon below. In that chamber, where a gaunt, hairy beast of a man in leather breeks squatted gnawing a beef bone voraciously, stood the machines of tonneau, racks, boots, hooks and all the implements that the human mind devises to tear flesh, break bones and rend and rupture veins and ligaments. On a rack a man was stretched naked, and a glance told Conan that he was dying. The unnatural elongation of his limbs and body told of unhinged joints and unnumberable ruptures. He was a dark man, with an intelligent, aquiline face and quick dark eyes. They were glazed and bloodshot now with pain, and the dew of agony glistened on his face. His lips were drawn back from blackened gums. "There is the box." Viciously Valbroso kicked a small but heavy iron chest that stood on the floor nearby. It was intricately carved, with tiny skulls and writhing dragons curiously intertwined, but Conan saw no catch or hasp that might serve to unlock the lid. The marks of fire, of axe and sledge and chisel showed on it but as scratches. "This is the dog's treasure box," said Valbroso angrily. "All men of the south know of Zarathus and his iron chest. Mitra knows what is in it. But he will not give up its secret. Zarathus." It was true, then, the man he sought lay before him. Conan's heart beat suffocatingly as he leaned over the writhing form, though he exhibited no evidence of his painful eagerness. "Ease those ropes, knave," he ordered the torturer harshly, and Valbroso and his captain stared. In the forgetfulness of the moment Conan had used his imperial tone, and the brute in leather instinctively obeyed the knife edge of command in that voice. He eased away gradually, for else the slackening of the ropes had been as great a torment to the torn joints as fun her stretching. Catching up a vessel of wine that stood nearby, Conan placed the rim to the wretch's lips. Zarathus gulped spasmodically, the liquid slopping over on his heaving breast. Into the bloodshot eyes came a gleam of recognition, and the froth-smeared lips parted. From them issued a racking whimper in the Gothic tongue. Is this death, then? Is the long agony ended? For this is King Conan who died at Valkia, and I am among the dead. You're not dead, said Conan. But you're dying. You'll be tortured no more. I'll see to that. But I can't help you further. Yet before you die, tell me how to open your iron box. My iron box, mumbled Zarathus in delirious disjointed phrases. The chest forged in unholy fires among the flaming mountains of Crotia, the metal no chisel can cut. How many treasures has it borne, across the width and the breadth of the world? But no such treasure as it now holds. Tell me how to open it, urged Conan. It can do you no good, and it may aid me. You are Conan, muttered the Kothian. I'll have seen you sitting on your throne in the great public hall of Turanshia, with your crown on your head and the scepter in your hand. But you are dead, you died at Valkia. And so I know my own end is at hand. What does the dog say? Demanded Valbroso impatiently, not understanding Gothic. Will he tell us how to open the box? As if the voice roused a spark of life in the twisted breast, Zarathus rolled his bloodshot eyes toward the speaker. Only Valbroso will I tell, he gasped in Zingaran. Death is upon me. Lean close to me, Valbroso. The Count did so, his dark face lit with avarice. Behind him his saturnine captain, Blosso, crowded closer. Press the 7 skulls on the rim, one after another, gasped Zarathus. Press then the head of the dragon that writhes across the lid. Then press the sphere in the dragon's claws. That will release the secret catch. Quick, the box, cried Valbroso with an oath. Conan lifted it and set it on a dais, and Valbroso shouldered him aside. Let me open it, cried Blosso, starting forward. Valbroso cursed him back, his greed blazing in his black eyes. None but me shall open it, he cried. Conan, whose hand had instinctively gone to his hilt, glanced at Zarathus. The man's eyes were glazed and bloodshot, but they were fixed on Valbroso with bumming intensity, and was there the shadow of a grim twisted smile on the dying man's lips. Not until the merchant knew he was dying had he given up the secret. Conan turned to watch Valbroso, even as the dying man watched him. Along the rim of the lid 7 skulls were carved among intertwining branches of strange trees. An inlaid dragon writhed its way across the top of the lid amid omate arabesques. Valbroso pressed the skulls in fumbling haste, and as he jammed his thumb down on the carved head of the dragon he swore sharply and snatched his hand away, shaking it in irritation. A sharp point on the carvings, he snarled. TVE pricked my thumb. He pressed the gold ball clutched in the dragon's talons, and the lid flew abruptly open. Their eyes were dazzled by a golden flame. It seemed to their dazed minds that the carven box was full of glowing fire that spilled over the rim and dripped through the air in quivering flakes. Blosso cried out, and Valbroso sucked in his breath. Conan stood speechless, his brain snared by the blaze. Mitra, what a jewel! Valbroso's hand dived into the chest, came out with a great pulsing crimson sphere that filled the room with a lambent glow. In its glare Valbroso looked like a corpse. And the dying man on the loosened rack laughed wildly and suddenly. Fool, he screamed. The jewel is yours. I give you death with it. The scratch on your thumb, look at the dragon's head, Valbroso. They all wheeled, stared. Something tiny and dully gleaming stood up from the gaping, carved mouth. The dragon's fang, shrieked Zarathus. Steeped in the venom of the black Stygian scorpion. Fool, fool, to open the box of Zarathus with your naked hand. Death. You are a dead man now. And with bloody foam on his lips he died. Valbroso staggered, crying out. Ah, Mitra, I bum, he shrieked. My veins race with liquid fire. My joints are bursting asunder. Death. Death. And he reeled and crashed headlong. There was an instant of awful convulsions, in which the limbs were twisted into hideous and unnatural positions, and then in that posture the man froze, his glassy eyes staring sightlessly upward, his lips drawn back from blackened gums. Dead, muttered Conan, stooping to pick up the jewel where it rolled on the floor from Valbrosso's rigid hand. It lay on the floor like a quivering pool of sunset fire. Dead, muttered Blosso, with madness in his eyes. And then he moved. Conan was caught off guard, his eyes dazzled, his brain dazed by the blaze of the great gem. He did not realize Blosso's intention until something crashed with terrible force upon his helmet. The glow of the jewel was splashed with redder flame, and he went to his knees under the blow. He heard a rush of feet, a bellow of ox-like agony. He was stunned but not wholly senseless, and realized that Blosso had caught up the iron box and crashed it down on his head as he stooped. Only his bassinet had saved his skull. He staggered up, drawing his sword, winged to shake the dimness out of his eyes. The room swam to his dizzy gaze. But the door was open and fleet footsteps were dwindling down the winding stair. On the floor the Bandish Tonyo was gasping out his life, with a great gash under his breast. And the heart of Ahriman was gone. Conan reeled out of the chamber, sword in hand, blood streaming down his face from under his burgane. He ran drunkenly down the steps, hearing a clang of steel in the courtyard below, shouts, then the frantic dntm of hoofs. Rushing into the bailey he saw the men-at-arms milling about confusedly, while women screeched. The postern gate stood open, and a soldier lay across his pike with his head split. Horses, still bridled and saddled, ran neighing about the court, Conan's black stallion among them. His mad, howled a woman, wringing her hands as she rushed brainlessly about. He came out of the castle like a mad dog, hewing right and left. Blosso's mad. Where's Lord Valbrosso? Which way did he go? Roared Conan. All turned and stared at the stranger's blood-stained face and naked sword. Through the postern, shrilled a woman, pointing eastward, and another bawled, "Who is this rogue?" "Blosso has killed Valbrosso," yelled Conan, leaping and seizing the stallion's mane, as the men-at-arms advanced uncertainly on him. A wild outcry burst forth at his news, but their reaction was exactly as he had anticipated. Instead of closing the gates to take him prisoner, or pursuing the fleeing slayer to avenge their lord, they were thrown into even greater confusion by his words. Wolves bound together only by fear of Valbrosso, they owed no allegiance to the castle or to each other. Swords began to clash in the courtyard, and women screamed. And in the midst of it all, none noticed Conan as he shot through the postern gate, and thundered down the hill. The wide plain spread before him, and beyond the hill the caravan road divided, one branch ran south, the other east. And on the eastern road he saw another rider, bending low and spurring hard. The plain swam to Conan's gaze, the sunlight was a thick red haze, and he reeled in his saddle, grasping the flowing mane with his hand. Blood rained on his mail, but grimly he urged the stallion on. Behind him smoke began to pour out of the castle on the hill where the count's body lay forgotten and unheeded beside that of his prisoner. The sun was setting, against a lurid red sky the two black figures fled. The stallion was not fresh, but neither was the horse ridden by Blosso. But the great beast responded mightily, calling on deep reservoirs of reserve vitality. Why the Singaran fled from one pursuer Conan did not tax his brised brain to guess. Perhaps unreasoning panic rode Blosso, bomb of the madness that lurked in that blazing jewel. The sun was gone, the white road was a dim glimmer through a ghostly twilight fading into purple gloom far ahead of him. The stallion panted, laboring hard. The country was changing, in the gathering dusk. Bare plains gave way to clumps of oaks and alders. Low hills mounted up in the distance. Stars began to blink out. The stallion gasped and reeled in his course. But ahead rose a dense wood that stretched to the hills on the horizon, and between it and himself Conan glimpsed the dim form of the fugitive. He urged on the distressed stallion, for he saw that he was overtaking his prey, yard by yard. Above the pound of the hoofs a strange cry rose from the shadows, but neither pursuer nor pursued gave heed. As they swept in under the branches that overhung the road, they were almost side by side. A fierce cry rose from Conan's lips, as his sword went up, a pale oval of a face was turned toward him, a sword gleamed in a half-seen hand, and Belosso echoed the cry, and then the weary stallion, with a lurch and a groan, missed his footing in the shadows, and went heels over head, hurling his dazed rider from the saddle. Conan's throbbing head crashed against a stone, and the stars were blotted out in a thicker night. How long Conan lay senseless he never knew. His first sensation of returning consciousness was that of being dragged by one arm over rough and stony ground, and through dense underbrush. Then he was thrown carelessly down, and perhaps the jolt brought back his senses. His helmet was gone, his head ached abominably, he felt a qualm of nausea, and blood was clotted thickly among his black locks. But with the vitality of a wild thing life and consciousness surged back into him, and he became aware of his surroundings. A broad red moon was shining through the trees, by which he knew that it was long after midnight. He had lain senseless for hours, long enough to have recovered from that terrible blow Belosso had dealt him, as well as the fall which had rendered him senseless. His brain felt clearer than it had felt during that mad ride after the fugitive. He was not lying beside the white road, he noticed with a start of surprise, as his surroundings began to record themselves on his perceptions. The road was nowhere in sight. He lay on the grassy earth, in a small glade hemmed in by a black wall of tree stems and tangled branches. His face and hands were scratched and lacerated as if he had been dragged through brambles. Shifting his body he looked about him. And then he started violently, something was squatting over him. At first Conan doubted his consciousness, thought it was but a figment of delirium. Surely it could not be real, that strange, motionless grey being that squatted on its haunches, and stared down at him with unblinking soulless eyes. Conan lay and stared, half expecting it to vanish like a figure of a dream, and then a chill of recollection crept along his spine. Half-forgotten memories surged back, of grisly tales whispered of the shapes that haunted these uninhabited forests at the foot of the hills that mark the Singaran-Argosine border. Ghouls, men called them, eaters of human flesh, spawn of darkness, children of unholy matings of a lost and forgotten race with the demons of the underworld. Somewhere in these primitive forests were the ruins of an ancient, accursed city, men whispered, and among its tombs slunk grey, anthropomorphic shadows. Conan shuddered strongly. He lay staring at the malformed head that rose dimly above him, and cautiously he extended a hand toward the sword at his hip. With a horrible cry that the man involuntarily echoed, the monster was at his throat. Conan threw up his right arm, and the dog-like jaws closed on it, driving the mailed links into the hard flesh. The misshapen yet man-like hands clutched for his throat, but he evaded them with a heave and roll of his whole body, at the same time drawing his dagger with his left hand. They tumbled over and over on the grass, smiting and tearing. The muscles coiling under that grey corpse-like skin were stringy and hard as steel wires, exceeding the strength of a man. But Conan's thews were iron too, and his mail saved him from the gnashing fangs and ripping claws long enough for him to drive home his dagger, again and again and again. The horrible vitality of the semi-human monstrosities seemed inexhaustible, and the king's skin crawled at the feel of that sleek, clammy flesh. He put all his loathing and savage revulsion behind the plunging blade, and suddenly the monster heaved up convulsively beneath him as the point found its grisly heart, and then lay still. Conan rose, shaken with nausea. He stood in the center of the glade uncertainly, sword in one hand and dagger in the other. He had not lost his instinctive sense of direction, as far as the points of the compass were concerned, but he did not know in which direction the road lay. He had no way of knowing in which direction the ghoul had dragged him. Conan glared at the silent, black, moon-dappled woods which ringed him, and felt cold moisture beat his flesh. He was without a horse and lost in these haunted woods, and that staring deformed thing at his feet was a mute evidence of the horrors that lurked in the forest. He stood almost holding his breath in his painful intensity, straining his ears for some crack of twig or rustle of grass. When a sound did come, he started violently. Suddenly out on the night air broke the scream of a terrified horse. His stallion. There were panthers in the beasts as well as men. He broke savagely through the brush in the direction of the sound, whistling shrilly as he ran, his fear drowned in berserk rage. If his horse was killed, there went his last chance of following Blosso and recovering the jewel. Again the stallion screamed with fear and ftui, somewhere nearer. There was a sound of lashing heels, and something that was snlck heavily and gave way. Conan burst out into the wide white road without warning, and saw the stallion plunging and rearing in the moonlight, his ears laid back, his eyes and teeth flashing wickedly. He lashed out with his heels at a slinking shadow that ducked and bobbed about him, and then about Conan other shadows moved, grey, furtive shadows that closed in on all sides. A hideous charnel house scent reeked up in the night air. With a curse the king hewed right and left with his broadsword, thrust and ripped with his dagger. Dripping fangs flashed in the moonlight, foul paws caught at him, but he hacked his way through to the stallion, caught the rein, leaped into the saddle. His sword rose and fell, a frosty arc in the moonlight, showering blood as it split misshapen heads, clove shambling bodies. The stallion reared, biting and kicking. They burst through and thundered down the road. On either hand, for a short space, flitted grey abhorrent shadows. Then these fell behind, and Conan, topping a wooded crest, saw a vast expanse of bare slopes sweeping up and away before him. 13. A ghost out of the past. Soon after sunrise Conan crossed the Argosine border. Of Blosso he had seen no trace. Either the captain had made good his escape while the king lay senseless, or had fallen prey to the grim man-eaters of the Singaran forest. But Conan had seen no signs to indicate the latter possibility. The fact that he had lain unmolested for so long seemed to indicate that the monsters had been engrossed in futile pursuit of the captain. And if the man lived, Conan felt certain that he was riding along the road somewhere ahead of him. Unless he had intended going into Argos, he would never have taken the eastward road in the first place. The helmeted guards at the frontier did not question the Cimmerian. A single wandering mercenary required no passport nor safe conduct, especially when his unadorned mail showed him to be in the service of no lord. Through the low, grassy hills where streams murmured and oak groves dappled the sward with lights and shadows he rode, following the long road that rose and fell away ahead of him over dales and rises in the blue distance. It was an old road, this highway from Poitiers to the sea. Argos was at peace, laden ox wains rumbled along the road, and men with bare, brown, brawny arms toiled in orchards and fields that smiled away under the branches of the roadside trees. Old men on settles before inns under spreading oak branches called greetings to the wayfarer. From the men that worked the fields, from the garrulous old men in the inns where he slaked his thirst, with great leathern jacks of foaming ale, from the sharp-eyed silk-clad merchants he met upon the road, Conan sought for news of Blosso. Stories were conflicting, but this much Conan learned, that a lean, wiry Zingaran with the dangerous black eyes and mustaches of the western folk was somewhere on the road ahead of him, and apparently making for Messencia. It was a logical destination. All the seaports of Argos were cosmopolitan, in strong contrast with the inland provinces, and Messencia was the most polyglot of all. Craft of all the maritime nations rode in its harbour, and refugees and fugitives from many lands gathered there. Laws were lax, for Messensia thrived on the trade of the sea, and her citizens found it profitable to be somewhat blind on their dealings with seamen. It was not only legitimate trade that flowed into Messensia, smugglers and buccaneers played their part. All this Conan knew well, for had he not, in the days of old when he was a Barachan pirate, sailed by night into the harbour of Messensia to discharge strange cargoes? Most of the pirates of the Barachan Isles, small islands off the southwestern coast of Zingara, were Argosine sailors, and as long as they confined their attentions to the shipping of other nations, the authorities of Argos were not too strict in their interpretation of sea laws. But Conan had not limited his activities to those of the Barachans. He had also sailed with the Zingaran buccaneers, and even with those wild black corsairs that swept up from the far south to Haney the northern coasts, and this put him beyond the pale of any law. If he were recognized in any of the ports of Argos it would cost him his head. But without hesitation he rode on to Messensia, halting day or night only to rest the stallion and to snatch a few winks of sleep for himself. He entered the city unquestioned, merging himself with the throngs that poured continually in and out of this great commercial center. No walls surrounded Messensia. The sea and the ships of the sea guarded the great southern trading city. It was evening when Conan rode leisurely through the streets that marched down to the waterfront. At the ends of these streets he saw the wharves and the masts and sails of ships. He smelled salt water for the first time in years, heard the thun of cordage and the creak of spars in the breeze that was kicking up whitecaps out beyond the headlands. Again the urge of far wandering tugged at his heart, but he did not go on to the wharves. He reined aside and rode up a steep flight of wide, worn stone steps, to a broad street where ornate white mansions overlooked the waterfront and the harbour below. Here dwelt the men who had grown rich from the hard-won fat of the seas, a few old sea captains who had found treasure afar, many traders and merchants who never trod the naked decks nor knew the roar of tempest or sea fight. Conan turned in his horse at a certain gold-worked gate, and rode into a court where a fountain tinkled and pigeons fluttered from marble coping to marble flagging. A page in jagged silken jupon and hose came from Var inquiringly. The merchants of Messensia dealt with many strange and rough characters, but most of these smacked of the sea. It was strange that a mercenary trooper should so freely ride into the court of a lord of commerce. The merchant Publio dwells here. It was more statement than question, and something in the timbre of the voice caused the page to doff his feather chaperon as he bowed and replied, "Aye, so he does, my captain." Conan dismounted and the page called a servitor, who came running to receive the stallion's rein. "Your master is within." Conan drew off his gauntlets and slapped the dust of the road from cloak and mail. "Aye, my captain." "Whom shall I announce?" "I'll announce myself," grunted Conan. "I'll know the way well enough. Bide you here." And obeying that peremptory command the page stood still, staring after Conan as the latter climbed a short flight of marble steps, and wondering what connection his master might have with this giant fighting man who had the aspect of a northern barbarian. Menials at their tasks halted and gaped open-mouthed as Conan crossed a wide, cool balcony overlooking the court, and entered a broad corridor through which the sea breeze swept. Halfway down this he heard a quill scratching, and turned into a broad room whose many wide casements overlooked the harbour. Publio sat at a carved teakwood desk writing on rich parchment, with a golden quill. He was a short man, with a massive head and quick dark eyes. His blue robe was of the finest watered silk, trimmed with cloth of gold, and from his thick white throat hung a heavy gold chain. As the Cimmerian entered, the merchant looked up with a gesture of annoyance. He froze in the midst of his gesture. His mouth opened, he stared as at a ghost out of the past. Unbelief and fear glimmered in his wide eyes. "Well," said Conan, "have you no word of greeting, Publio?" Publio moistened his lips. "Conan," he whispered incredulously. "Mitra? Conan? Amra? Who else?" The Cimmerian unclasped his cloak, and threw it with his gauntlets down upon the desk. "How, man," he exclaimed irritably. "Can't you at least offer me a beaker of wine? My throat's caked with the dust of the highway." "Aye, wine," echoed Publio mechanically. Instinctively his hand reached for a gong, then recoiled as from a hot coal, and he shuddered. While Conan watched him with a flicker of grim amusement in his eyes, the merchant rose and hurriedly shut the door, first craning his neck up and down the corridor to be sure that no slave was loitering about. Then, returning, he took a gold vessel of wine from a nearby table, and was about to fill a slender goblet, when Conan impatiently took the vessel from him, and lifting it with both hands, drank deep and with gusto. "Aye, it's Conan, right enough," muttered Publio. "Man, are you mad?" "By Crom, Publio," said Conan, lowering the vessel but retaining it in his hands, "you dwell in different quarters than of old. It takes an Argosine merchant to wring wealth out of a little waterfront shop that stank of rotten fish and cheap wine." "The old days are past," muttered Publio, drawing his robe about him with a slight involuntary shudder. "I have put off the past like a worn-out cloak." "Well," retorted Conan, "you can't put me off like an old cloak. It isn't much I want of you, but that much I do want. And you can't refuse me. We had too many dealings in the old days. Am I such a fool that I'm not aware that this fine mansion was built on my sweat and blood? How many cargoes from my galleys passed through your shop? All merchants of Messensia have dealt with the sea rovers at one time or another," mumbled Publio nervously. "But not with the black corsairs," answered Conan grimly. "For Mitra's sake, be silent," ejaculated Publio, sweat starting out on his brow. His fingers jerked at the gilt-worked edge of his robe. "Well, I only wished to recall it to your mind," answered Conan. "Don't be so fearful. You took plenty of risks in the past, when you were struggling for life and wealth in that lousy little shop down by the wharves, and were hand and glove with even buccaneer, and smuggler, and pirate from here to the Barichan Isles. Prosperity must have softened you." "Elam respectable," began Publio. "Meaning you're rich as hell," snorted Conan. "Why? Why did you grow wealthy so much quicker than your competitors? Was it because you did a big business in ivory, and ostrich feathers, copper and skins and pearls and hammered gold ornaments, and other things from the coast of Kush? And where did you get them so cheaply, while other merchants were paying their weight in silver to the Stygians for them? I'll tell you, in case you've forgotten, you bought them from me, at considerably less than their value, and I took them from the tribes of the Black Coast, and from the ships of the Stygians, and the Black Corsairs." "In Mitra's name, cease," begged Publio. "I have not forgotten. But what are you doing here?" "I am the only man in Argos who knew that the king of Aquilonia was once Conan the Buccaneer, in the old days. But word has come southward of the overthrow of Aquilonia, and the death of the king. My enemies have killed me 100 times by Ntmors," muttered Conan. "Yet here I sit and guzzle wine of Kiros." And he suited the action to the word. Lowering the vessel, which was now nearly empty, he said, "It's but a small thing I ask of you, Publio. I know that you're aware of everything that goes on in Messensia. I want to know if a Singaran named Blosso, or he might call himself anything, is in this city. He's tall and lean and dark like all his race, and it's likely he'll seek to sell a very rare jewel." Publio shook his head. "I have not heard of such a man. But thousands come and go in Messensia. If he is here, my agents will discover him." "Good. Send them to look for him. And in the meantime have my horse cared for, and have food served me here in this room." Publio assented volubly, and Conan emptied the wine vessel, tossed it carelessly into a corner, and strode to a nearby casement, involuntarily expanding his chest as he breathed deep of the salt air. He was looking down upon the meandering waterfront streets. He swept the ships in the harbor with an appreciative glance, then lifted his head and stared beyond the bay, far into the blue haze of the distance where sea met sky. And his memory sped beyond that horizon, to the golden seas of the south, under flaming suns, where laws were not and life ran hotly. Some vagrant scent of spice or palm woke clear-etched images of strange coasts where mangroves grew and drums thundered, of ships locked in battle and decks moaning blood, of smoke and flame and the crying of slaughter. Lost in his thoughts, he scarcely noticed when Publio stole from the chamber. Gathering up his robe, the merchant hurried along the corridors until he came to a certain chamber where a tall, gaunt man with a scar upon his temple wrote continually upon parchment. There was something about this man which made his clerkly occupation seem incongruous. To him Publio spoke admirably, "Conan has returned." "Conan?" The gaunt man started up and the quill fell from his fingers. "The corsair?" "Aye." The gaunt man went livid. "Is he mad? If he is discovered here we aren't lined. They will hang a man who shelters or trades with a corsair as quickly as they'll hang the corsair himself. What if the governor should learn of our past connections with him?" "He will not learn," answered Publio grimly. "Send your men into the markets and wharfside dives, and learn if one Blosso, a Zingaran, is in Messencia. Conan said he had a gem, which he will probably seek to dispose of. The jewel merchants should know of him, if any do. And here is another task for you, pick up a dozen or so desperate villains who can be mustered to do away with a man, and hold their tongues afterward. You understand me?" "I'll understand." The other nodded slowly and solemnly. "I have not stolen, cheated, lied and fought my way up from the gutter to be undone now by a ghost out of my past," muttered Publio, and the sinister darkness of his countenance at that moment would have surprised the wealthy nobles and ladies who bought their silks and pearls from his many stalls. But when he returned to Conan a short time later, bearing in his own hands a platter of fruit and meats, he presented a placid face to his unwelcome guest. Conan still stood at the casement, staring down into the harbour, at the temple, and crimson and vermilion and scarlet sails of galleons, and carracks, and galleys and dromons. "There's a Stygian galley, if I'm not blind," he remarked, pointing to a long, slim black ship lying apart from the others, anchored off the low broad sandy beach that curved round to the distant headland. "Is there peace, then, between Stygia and Argos?" "The same sort that has existed before," answered Publio, setting the platter on the table with a sigh of relief, for it was heavily laden. He knew his guest of old. "Stygian ports are temporarily open to our ships, as ours to theirs. But may no craft of mine meet their cursed galleys out of sight of land. That galley crept into the bay last night. What its masters wish I do not know. So far they have neither bought nor sold. I distrust those dark-skinned devils. Tresh one why had its birth in that dusky land Ive made them howl," said Conan carelessly, turning from the window. "In my galley manned by black corsairs I crept to the very bastions of the sea-washed castles of black-walled Chemi by night, and burned the galleons anchored there. And speaking of treachery, mine host, suppose you taste these viands, and sip a bit of this wine, just to show me that your heart is on the right side." Publio complied so readily that Conan's suspicions were lulled, and without further hesitation he sat down and devoured enough for 3 men. And while he ate, men moved through the markets and along the waterfront, searching for a Zingaran who had a jewel to sell or who sought for a ship to carry him to foreign ports. And a tall gaunt man with a scar on his temples sat with his elbows on a wine-stained table in a squalid cellar with a brass lantern hanging from a smoke-blackened beam overhead, and held converse with 10 desperate rogues, whose sinister countenances and ragged garments proclaimed their profession. And as the first stars blinked out, they shone on a strange band spurring their mounts along the white road that led to Messencia from the west. They were 4 men, tall, gaunt, clad in black, hooded robes, and they did not speak. They forced their steeds mercilessly onward, and those steeds were gaunt as themselves, and sweat-stained and weary as if from long travel and far wandering. 14 The Black Hand of Set. Conan woke from a sound sleep as quickly and instantly as a cat. And like a cat he was on his feet, with his sword out before the man who had touched him could so much as draw back. "What word, Publio?" demanded Conan, recognizing his host. The gold lamp burned low, casting a mellow glow over the thick tapestries and the rich coverings of couch whereon he had been reposing. Publio, recovering from the start given him by the sudden action of his awakening guest, replied, "The Singaran has been located. He arrived yesterday, at dawn. Only a few hours ago he sought to sell a huge, strange jewel to a Shmitish merchant, but the Shmite would have naught to do with it. Men say he turned pale beneath his black beard at the sight of it, and closing his stall, fled as from a thing accursed." "It must be Belosso," muttered Conan, feeling the pulse in his temples pounding with impatient eagerness. "Where is he now?" "He sleeps in the house of Servio." "I know that dive of old," muttered Conan. "Td better hasten before some of these waterfront thieves cut his throat for the jewel." He took up his cloak and flung it over his shoulders, then donned a helmet Publio had procured for him. "Have my steed saddled and ready in the court," said he. "I may return in haste." "I shall not forget this night's work, Publio." A few moments later Publio, standing at a small outer door, watched the king's tall figure receding down the shadowy street. "Farewell to you, Corsair," muttered the merchant. "This must be a notable jewel, to be sought by a man who has just lost a kingdom. I wish I had told my knaves to let him secure it before they did their work. But then, something might have gone awry. Let Argus forget Amra, and let my dealings with him be lost in the dust of the past. In the alley behind the house of Servio, that is where Conan will cease to be a peril to me." Servio's house, a dingy, ill-famed den, was located close to the wharves, facing the waterfront. It was a shambling building of stone and heavy ship beams, and a long narrow alley wandered up alongside it. Conan made his way along the alley, and as he approached the house he had an uneasy feeling that he was being spied upon. He stared hard into the shadows of the squalid buildings, but saw nothing, though once he caught the faint rasp of cloth or leather against flesh. But that was nothing unusual. Thieves and beggars prowled these alleys all night, and they were not likely to attack him, after one look at his size and harness. But suddenly a door opened in the wall ahead of him, and he slipped into the shadow of an arch. A figure emerged from the open door, and moved along the alley, not furtively, but with a natural noiselessness, like that of a jungle beast. Enough starlight filtered into the alley to silhouette the man's profile dimly as he passed the dunvey where Conan lurked. The stranger was a Stygian. There was no mistaking that hawk-faced, shaven head, even in the starlight, nor the mantle over the broad shoulders. He passed on down the alley in the direction of the beach, and once Conan thought he must be carrying a lantern among his garments, for he caught a flash of lambent light, just as the man vanished. But the Cimmerian forgot the stranger, as he noticed that the door through which he had emerged still stood open. Conan had intended entering by the main entrance, and forcing Servio to show him the room where the Singaran slept. But if he could get into the house without attracting anyone's attention, so much the better. A few long strides brought him to the door, and as his hand fell on the lock he stifled an involuntary grunt. His practiced fingers, skilled among the thieves of Zamora long ago, told him that the lock had been forced, apparently by some terrific pressure from the outside that had twisted and bent the heavy iron bolts, tearing the very sockets loose from the jambs. How such damage could have been wrought so violently without awakening everyone in the neighborhood Conan could not imagine, but he felt sure that it had been done that night. A broken lock, if discovered, would not go unmended in the house of Servio, in this neighborhood of thieves and cutthroats. Conan entered stealthily, poniard in hand, wondering how he was to find the chamber of the Singaran. Groping in total darkness he halted suddenly. He sensed death in that room, as a wild beast senses it, not as peril threatening him, but a dead thing, something freshly slain. In the darkness his foot hit and recoiled from something heavy and yielding. With a sudden premonition he groped along the wall until he found the shelf that supported the brass lamp, with its flint, steel, and tinder beside it. A few seconds later a flickering, uncertain light sprang up, and he stared narrowly about him. A bunk built against the rough stone wall, a bare table and a bench completed the furnishings of the squalid chamber. An inner door stood closed and bolted. And on the hard-beaten dirt floor lay Blosso. On his back he lay, with his head drawn back between his shoulders so that he seemed to stare with his wide glassy eyes at the sooty beams of the cobwebbed ceiling. His lips were drawn back from his teeth in a frozen grin of agony. His sword lay near him, still in its scabbard. His shift was torn open, and on his brown, muscular breast was the print of a black hand, thumb, and forefingers plainly distinct. Conan glared in silence, feeling the short hairs bristle at the back of his neck. "Crom," he muttered. "The Black Hand of Set." He had seen that mark of old, the death mark of the Black Priests of Set, the grim cult that ruled in dark Stygia. And suddenly he remembered that curious flash he had seen emanating from the mysterious Stygian who had emerged from this chamber. "The heart, by Crom," he muttered. He was carrying it under his mantle. He stole it. He burst that door by his magic, and slew Blosso. He was a priest of Set. A quick investigation confirmed at least part of his suspicions. The jewel was not on the Singaran's body. An uneasy feeling rose in Conan that this had not happened by chance, or without design, a conviction that the mysterious Stygian galley had come into the harbor of Messencyr on a definite mission. How could the priests of Set know that the heart had come southward? Yet the thought was no more fantastic than the necromancy that could slay an armed man by the touch of an open, empty hand. A stealthy footfall outside the door brought him round like a great cat. With one motion he extinguished the lamp and drew his sword. His ears told him that men were out there in the darkness, were closing in on the doorway. As his eyes became accustomed to the sudden darkness, he could make out dim figures ringing the entrance. He could not guess their identity, but as always he took the initiative, leaping suddenly forth from the doorway without awaiting the attack. His unexpected movement took the skulkers by surprise. He sensed and heard men close about him, saw a dim masked figure in the starlight before him, then his sword crunched home, and he was fleeting away down the alley before the slower thinking and slower acting attackers could intercept. As he ran he heard, somewhere ahead of him, a faint creak of oarlocks, and he forgot the men behind him. A boat was moving out into the bay. Gritting his teeth he increased his speed, but before he reached the beach he heard the rasp and creak of ropes, and the grind of the great sweep in its socket. Thick clouds, rolling up from the sea, obscured the stars. In thick darkness Conan came upon the strand, straining his eyes out across the black restless water. Something was moving out there, a long, low, black shape that receded in the darkness, gathering momentum as it went. To his ears came the rhythmical clack of long oars. He ground his teeth in helpless fury. It was the Stygian galley, and she was racing out to sea, bearing with her the jewel that meant to him the throne of Aquilonia. With a savage curse he took a step toward the waves that lapped against the sands, catching at his hauberk and intending to rip it off and swim after the vanishing ship. Then the crunch of a heel in the sand brought him about. He had forgotten his pursuers. Dark figures closed in on him with a rush of feet through the sands. The first went down beneath the Cimmerian's flailing sword, but the others did not falter. Blades whickered dimly about him in the darkness or rasped on his mail. Blood and entrails spilled over his hand, and someone screamed as he ripped murderously upward. A muttered voice spurred on the attack, and that voice sounded vaguely familiar. Conan plowed through the clinging, hacking shapes toward the voice. A faint light gleaming momentarily through the drifting clouds showed him a tall gaunt man, with a great livid scar on his temple. Conan's sword sheared through his skull as through a ripe melon. Then an axe, swung blindly in the dark, crashed on the king's bassinet, filling his eyes with sparks of fire. He lurched and lunged, felt his sword sink deep and heard a shriek of agony. Then he stumbled over a corpse, and a bludgeon knocked the dented helmet from his head. The next instant the club fell full on his unprotected skull. The king of Aquilonia pulled into the wet sands. Over him wolfish figures panted in the gloom. "Strike off his head," muttered one. "Let him lie," grunted another. "Help me tie up my wounds before I bleed to death. The tide will wash him into the bay." See, he fell at the water's edge. His skull's split, no man could live after such blows. "Help me strip him," urged another. "His harness will fetch a few pieces of silver. And haste. Tiberio is dead, and I hear seamen singing as they reel along the strand. Let us be gone." There followed hurried activity in the darkness, and then the sound of quickly receding footsteps. The tipsy singing of the seaman grew louder. In his chamber, Publio, nervously pacing back and forth before a window that overlooked the shadowed bay, whirled suddenly, his nerves tingling. To the best of his knowledge the door had been bolted from within, but now it stood open and 4 men filed into the chamber. At the sight of them his flesh crawled. Many strange beings Publio had seen in his lifetime, but none before like these. They were tall and gaunt, black-robed, and their faces were dim yellow ovals in the shadows of their coifs. He could not tell much about their features, and was unreasoningly glad that he could not. Each bore a long, curiously mottled staff. "Who are you?" he demanded, and his voice sounded brittle and hollow. "What do you wish here?" "Where is Conan, he who was king of Aquilonia?" demanded the tallest of the 4 in a passionless monotone that made Publio shudder. It was like the hollow tone of a Khitan temple bell. "I do not know what you mean," stammered the merchant, his customary poise shaken by the uncanny aspect of his visitors. No such man. He has been here," returned the other with no change of inflection. "His horse is in the courtyard. Tell us where he is before we do you an injury." "Jubal," shouted Publio frantically, recoiling until he crouched against the wall. "Jubal." The 4 Khitans watched him without emotion or change of expression. "If you summon your slave he will die," warned one of them, which only served to terrify Publio more than ever. "Jubal," he screamed. "Where are you, curse you? Thieves are murdering your master." Swift footsteps padded in the corridor outside, and Jubal burst into the chamber, a Shemite, of medium height and mightily muscled build, his curled blue-black beard bristling, and a short leaf-shaped sword in his hand. He stared in stupid amazement at the 4 invaders, unable to understand their presence, dimly remembering that he had drowsed unexplainably on the stair he was guarding and up which they must have come. He had never slept on duty before. But his master was shrieking with a note of hysteria in his voice, and the Shemite drove like a bull at the strangers, his thickly muscled arm drawing back for the disembowelling thrust. But the stroke was never dealt. A black-sleeved arm shot out, extending the long staff. Its end but touched the Shemite's brawny breast, and was instantly withdrawn. The stroke was horribly like the dan and recovery of a serpent's head. Jubal halted short in his headlong plunge, as if he had encountered a solid barrier. His bull head toppled forward on his breast, the sword slipped from his fingers, and then he melted slowly to the floor. It was as if all the bones of his frame had suddenly become flabby. "Publio Tumsic. Do not shout again," advised the tallest Khitan. "Your servants sleep soundly, but if you awaken them they will die, and you with them." "Where is Conan?" "He is gone to the house of Servio, near the waterfront, to search for the Singaran Belosso," gasped Publio, all his power of resistance gone out of him. The merchant did not lack courage, but these uncanny visitants turned his marrow to water. He started convulsively at a sudden noise of footsteps honeying up the stair outside, loud in the ominous stillness. "Your servant?" asked the Khitan. Publio shook his head mutely, his tongue frozen to his palate. He could not speak. One of the kittens caught up a silken cover from a couch, and threw it over the corpse. Then they melted behind the tapestry, but before the tallest man disappeared, he murmured, "Talk to this man who comes, and send him away quickly. If you betray us, neither he nor you will live to reach that door. Make no sign to show him you are not alone." And lifting his staff suggestively, the yellow man faded behind the hangings. Publio shuddered and choked down a desire to retch. It might have been a trick of the light, but it seemed to him that occasionally those staffs moved slightly of their own accord, as if possessed of an unspeakable life of their. He pulled himself together with a mighty effort, and presented a composed aspect to the ragged ruffian who burst into the chamber. "We have done as you wished, my lord," this man exclaimed. "The barbarian lies dead on the sands, at the water's edge." Publio felt a movement in the arrows behind him, and almost burst from fright. The man swept heedlessly on. "Your secretary, Tiberio, is dead. The barbarian slew him, and 4 of my companions. We bore their bodies to the rendezvous. There was nothing of value on the barbarian except a few silver coins. Are there any further orders?" "None," gasped Publio, white about the lips. "Go." The desperado bowed and hurried out, with a vague feeling that Publio was both a man of weak stomach and few words. The 4 kittens came from behind the arras. "Of whom did this man speak?" the taller demanded. "Of a wandering stranger who did me an injury," panted Publio. "You lie," said the kitten calmly. "He spoke of the king of Aquilonia. I read it in your expression. Sit upon that divan and do not move or speak. I will remain with you while my 3 companions go search for the body." So Publio sat and shook with terror of the silent, inscrutable figure which watched him, until the 3 kittens filed back into the room, with the news that Conan's body did not lie upon the sands. Publio did not know whether to be glad or sorry. "We found the spot where the fight was fought," they said. "Blood was on the sand. But the king was gone." The 4th kitten drew imaginal Y symbols upon the carpet with his staff, which glistened scalily in the lamplight. "Did you read naught from the sands?" he asked. "Aye," they answered. "The king lives, and he has gone southward in a ship." The tall kitten lifted his head, and gazed at Publio, so that the merchant broke into a profuse sweat. "What do you wish of me?" he stuttered. "A ship," answered the kitten. "A ship well manned for a long voyage." "For how long a voyage?" stammered Publio, never thinking of refusing. "To the ends of world, perhaps," answered the kitten, "or to the molten seas of hell that lie beyond the sunrise." 15. The return of the corsair. Conan's first sensation of returning consciousness was that of motion. Under him was no solidity, but a ceaseless heaving and plunging. Then he heard wind humming through cords and spars, and knew he was aboard a ship even before his blurred sight cleared. He heard a mutter of voices, and then a dash of water deluged him, jerking him sharply into full animation. He heaved up with a sulphurous curse, braced his legs and glared about him, with a burst of coarse guffaws in his ears, and the reek of unwashed bodies in his nostrils. He was standing on the poop deck of a long galley, which was running before the wind, that whipped down from the north, her striped sail bellying against the taut sheets. The sun was just rising, in a dazzling blaze of gold, and blue and green. To the left of the shoreline was a dim purple shadow. To the right stretched the open ocean. This much Conan saw at a glance that likewise included the ship itself. It was long and narrow, a typical trading ship off southern coasts, high of poop and stern, with cabins at either extremity. Conan looked down into the open waste, whence wafted that sickening abominable odor. He knew it of old. It was the body scent of the oarsmen, chained to their benches. They were all Negroes, F01 time men to each side, each confined by a chain locked about his waist, with the other end welded to a heavy ring set deep in the solid way beam that ran between the benches from stem to stern. The life of a slave aboard an Argosine galley was a hell unfathomable. Most of these were Cushites, but some 30 of the blacks who now rested on their idle oars and stared up at the stranger with dull curiosity were from the far southern isles, the homelands of the corsairs. Conan recognized them by their straighter features and hair, their rangier, clean-limbed build. And he saw among them men who had followed him of old. But all this he saw and recognized in one swift, all-embracing glance as he rose, before he turned his attention to the figures about him. Reeling momentarily on braced legs, his fists clenched wrathfully, he glared at the figures clustered about him. The sailor who had drenched him stood grinning, the empty bucket still poised in his hand, and Conan cursed him with venom, instinctively reaching for his hilt. Then he discovered that he was weaponless and naked except for his short leather breeks. "What lousy tub is this?" he roared. "How did I come aboard here?" The sailors laughed jeeringly, stocky, bearded Argosines to a man, and one, whose rich address and air of command proclaimed him captain, folded his arms and said domineeringly, "We found you lying on the sands. Somebody had wrapped you on the pate, and taken your clothes. Needing an extra man, we brought you aboard." "What ship is this?" Conan demanded. "The Venture, out of Messencia, with a cargo of mirrors, scarlet silk cloaks, shields, gilded helmets, and swords to trade to the Schmitz for copper and gold ore. I am Demetrio, captain of this vessel and your master henceforward." "Then I'm headed in the direction I wanted to go, after all," muttered Conan, heedless of that last remark. They were racing southeastward, following the long curve of the Argosine coast. These trading ships never ventured far from the shoreline. Somewhere ahead of him he knew that low dark Stygian galley was speeding southward. "Have you sighted a Stygian galley?" began Conan, but the beard of the burly, brutal-faced captain bristled. He was not in the least interested in any question his prisoner might wish to ask, and felt it high time he reduced this independent wastrel to his proper place. "Get forward," he roared. "I've wasted time enough with you. I've done you the honor of having you brought to the poop to be revived, and answered enough of your infernal questions. Get off this poop. You'll work your way aboard this galley." "I'll buy your ship," began Conan, before he remembered that he was a penniless wanderer. A roar of rough mirth greeted these words, and the captain turned purple, thinking he sensed ridicule. "You mutinous swine," he bellowed, taking a threatening step forward, while his hand closed on the knife at his belt. "Get forward before I have you flogged. You'll keep a civil tongue in your jaws, or by Mitra, I'll have you chained among the blacks to tug an oar." Conan's volcanic temper, never long at best, burst into explosion. Not in years, even before he was king, had a man spoken to him thus and lived. "Don't lift your voice to me, you tar-breeched dog," he roared in a voice as gusty as the sea wind, while the sailors gaped dumbfounded. "Draw that toy and I'll feed you to the fishes." "Who do you think you are?" gasped the captain. "I'll show you," roared the maddened Cimmerian, and he wheeled and bounded toward the rail, where weapons hung in their brackets. The captain drew his knife and ran at him bellowing, but before he could strike, Conan gripped his wrist with a wrench that tore the arm clean out of the socket. The captain bellowed like an ox in agony, and then rolled clear across the deck as he was hurled contemptuously from his attacker. Conan ripped a heavy axe from the rail, and wheeled cat-like to meet the rush of the sailors. They ran in, giving tongue like hounds, clumsy-footed and awkward in comparison to the panthish Cimmerian. Before they could reach him with their knives he sprang among them, striking right and left too quickly for the eye to follow, and blood and brains spattered as two corpses struck the deck. Knives flailed the air wildly as Conan broke through the stumbling, gasping mob and bounded to the narrow bridge that spanned the waist from poop to forecastle, just out of reach of the slaves below. Behind him the handful of sailors on the poop were floundering after him, daunted by the destruction of their fellows, and the rest of the crew, some 30 in all, came running across the bridge toward him, with weapons in their hands. Conan bounded out on the bridge, and stood poised above the upturned black faces, axe lifted, black mane blown in the wind. "Who am I?" he yelled. "Look, you dogs. Look, Ajonga, Yasunga, Laranga. Who am one?" And from the waist rose a shout that swelled to a mighty roar, "Amra! It is Amra! The lion has returned!" The sailors who caught and understood the burden of that awesome shout paled and shrank back, staring in sudden fear at the wild figure on the bridge. Was this in truth that bloodthirsty ogre of the southern seas who had so mysteriously vanished years ago, but who still lived in gory legends? The blacks were frothing crazy now, shaking and tearing at their chains, and shrieking the name of Amra like an invocation. Cushites who had never seen Conan before took up the yell. The slaves in the pen under the after cabin began to batter at the walls, shrieking like the damned. Demetrio, hitching himself along the deck on one hand, and his knees, livid with the agony of his dislocated arm, screamed, "In and kill him, dogs, before the slaves break loose." Fired to desperation by that word, the most dread to all Gallowmen, the sailors charged onto the bridge from both ends. But with a lion-like bound Conan left the bridge, and hit like a cat on his feet on the way between the benches. "Death to the masters," he thundered, and his axe rose and fell crashingly full on a shackle chain, severing it like matchwood. In an instant a shrieking slave was free, splintering his oar for a bludgeon. Men were racing frantically along the bridge above, and all hell and bedlam broke loose on the Venture. Conan's axe rose and fell without pause, and with even stroke a frothing, screaming black giant broke free, mad with hate and the fury of freedom and vengeance. Sailors leaping down into the waist to grapple or smite at the naked white giant hewing like one possessed at the shackles, found themselves dragged down by the hands of slaves yet unfreed, while others, their broken chains whipping and snapping about their limbs, came up out of the waist like a blind, black torrent, screaming like fiends, smiting with broken oars and pieces of iron, tearing and rending with talons and teeth. In the midst of the melee the slaves in the pen broke down the walls, and came surging up on the decks, and with 50 blacks freed of their benches Conan abandoned his iron hewing and bounded up on the bridge to add his notched axe to the bludgeons of his partisans. Then it was massacre. The Argocenes were strong, sturdy, fearless like all their race, trained in the brutal school of the sea. But they could not stand against these maddened giants, led by the tigerish barbarian. Blows and abuse and hellish suffering were avenged in one red gust of fury that raged like a typhoon from one end of the ship to the other, and when it had blown itself out, but one white man lived aboard the Venture, and that was the blood-stained giant about whom the chanting blacks thronged to cast themselves prostrate on the bloody deck, and beat their heads against the boards in an ecstasy of hero worship. Conan, his mighty chest heaving and glistening with sweat, the red axe gripped in his blood-smeared hand, glared about him as the first chief of men might have glared in some primordial dawn, and shook back his black mane. In that moment he was not king of Aquilonia, he was again lord of the black corsairs, who had hacked his way to lordship through flame and blood. "Amra! Amra!" chanted the delirious blacks, those who were left to chant. "The lion has returned. Now will the Stygians howl like dogs in the night, and the black dogs of Kush will howl. Now will villages burst in flames, and ships founder. Aie, there will be wailing of women, and the thunder of the spears. Cease this yamming, dogs!" Conan roared in a voice that drowned the clap of the sail in the wind. 10 of you go below and free the oarsmen who are yet chained. The rest of you man the sweeps and bend to oars and halyards. Crom's devils, don't you see we've drifted inshore during the fight? Do you want to run aground and be retaken by the Argocenes? Throw these carcasses overboard. Jump to it, you rogues, or I'll notch your hides for you. With shouts and laughter and wild singing they leaped to do his commands. The corpses, white and black, were hurled overboard, where triangular fins were already cutting the water. Conan stood on the poop, frowning down at the black men who watched him expectantly. His heavy brown arms were folded, his black hair, grown long in his wanderings, blew in the wind. A wilder and more barbaric figure never trod the bridge of a ship, and in this ferocious corsair few of the courtiers of Aquilonia would have recognized their king. "There's food in the hold," he roared. "Weapons in plenty for you, for this ship carried blades and harnessed to the Schmerz who dwell along the coast. There are enough of us to work ship, aye, and to fight. You rowed in chains for the Argosine dogs, will you row as free men for Amra?" "Aye," they roared. "We are thy children. Lead us where you will. Then fall to and clean out that waste," he commanded. "Free men don't labor in such filth. 3 Ophiao, come with me and break out food from the after cabin. By Crom, I'll pad out your ribs before this lies is done." Another yell of approbation answered him, as the half-starved blacks scurried to do his bidding. The sail bellied as the wind swept over the waves with renewed force, and the white crests danced along the sweep of the wind. Conan planted his feet to the heave of the deck, breathed deep and spread his mighty arms. King of Aquilonia he might no longer be, king of the blue ocean he was still. 16. Black-walled Chemi. The Venture swept southward like a living thing, her oars pulled now by free and willing hands. She had been transformed from a peaceful trader into a war galley, insofar as the transformation was possible. Men sat at the benches now with swords at their sides, and gilded helmets on their kinky heads. Shields were hung along the rails, and sheafs of spears, bows, and arrows adorned the mast. Even the elements seemed to work for Conan now. The broad purple sail bellied to a stiff breeze that held day by day, needing little aid from the oars. But though Conan kept a man on the masthead day and night, they did not sight a long, low, black galley fleeing southward ahead of them. Day by day the blue waters rolled empty to their view, broken only by fishing craft which fled like frightened birds before them, at sight of the shields hung along the rail. The season for trading was practically over for the year, and they sighted no other ships. When the lookout did sight a sail, it was to the north, not the south. Far on the skyline behind them appeared a racing galley, with full spread of purple sail. The blacks urged Conan to turn and plunder it, but he shook his head. Somewhere south of him a slim black galley was racing toward the ports of Stygia. That night, before darkness shut down, the lookout's last glimpse showed him the racing galley on the horizon, and at dawn it was still hanging on their tail, afar off, tiny in the distance. Conan wondered if it was following him, though he could think of no logical reason for such a supposition. But he paid little heed. Each day that carried him farther southward filled him with fiercer impatience. Doubts never assailed him. As he believed in the rise and set of the sun, he believed that a priest of Set had stolen the heart of Ahriman. And where would a priest of Set carry it but to Stygia? The blacks sensed his eagerness, and toiled as they had never toiled under the lash, though ignorant of his goal. They anticipated a red career of pillage and plunder, and were content. The men of the southern isles knew no other trade, and the Cushites of the crew joined wholeheartedly in the prospect of looting their own people, with the callousness of their race. Blood ties meant little, a victorious chieftain, and personal gain everything. Soon the character of the coastline changed. No longer they sailed past steep cliffs with blue hills marching behind them. Now the shore was the edge of broad meadowlands, which barely rose above the water's edge, and swept away and away into the hazy distance. Here were few harbors and fewer ports, but the green plain was dotted with the cities of the Schmerz, green sea, lapping the rim of the green plains, and the cigarettes of the cities gleaming whitely in the sun, some small in the distance. Through the grazing lands moved the herds of cattle, and squat, broad riders with cylindrical helmets, and curled blue-black beards, with bows in their hands. This was the shore of the lands of Shem, where there was no law save as each city-state could enforce its own. Far to the eastward, Conan knew, the meadowlands gave way to desert, where there were no cities, and the nomadic tribes roamed unhindered. Still as they plied southward, past the changeless panorama of city-dotted meadowland, at last the scene again began to alter. Clumps of tamarind appeared, the palm groves grew denser. The shoreline became more broken, a marching rampart of green fronds and trees, and behind them rose bare, sandy hills. Streams poured into the sea, and along their moist banks vegetation grew thick and of vast variety. So at last they passed the mouth of a broad river that mingled its flow with the ocean, and saw the great black walls and towers of Kemi rise against the southern horizon. The river was the Styx, the real border of Stygia. Kemi was Stygia's greatest port, and at that time her most important city. The king dwelt at more ancient Lucker, but in Kemi reigned the priestcraft, though men said the center of their dark religion lay far inland, in a mysterious, deserted city near the bank of the Styx. This river, springing from some nameless source far in the unknown lands south of Stygia, ran northward for 1,000 miles before it turned and flowed westward for some hundreds of miles, to empty at last into the ocean. The Venture, showing no lights, stole past the port in the night, and before dawn discovered her, anchored in a small bay a few miles south of the city. It was surrounded by marsh, a green tangle of mangroves, palms and lianas, swarming with crocodiles and serpents. Discovery was extremely unlikely. Conan knew the place of old, he had hidden there before, in his corsair days. As they slid silently past the city, whose great black bastions rose on the jutting prongs of land which locked the harbor, torches gleamed and smoldered luridly, and to their ears came the low thunder of drums. The port was not crowded with ships, as were the harbors of Argos. The Stygians did not base their glow and power upon ships and fleets. Trading vessels and war galleys, indeed, they had, but not in proportion to their inland strength. Many of their craft plied up and down the great river, rather than along the sea coasts. The Stygians were an ancient race, a dark, inscrutable people, powerful and merciless. Long ago their rule had stretched far north of the Styx, beyond the meadowlands of Shem, and into the fertile uplands now inhabited by the peoples of Koth, and Offa, and Argos. Their borders had marched with those of ancient Icheran. But Icheran had fallen, and the barbaric ancestors of the Hyborians had swept southward in wolfskins and horned helmets, driving the ancient rulers of the land before them. The Stygians had not forgotten. All day the Venture lay at anchor in the tiny bay, walled in with green branches and tangled vines through which flitted gay-plumed, harsh-voiced birds, and among which glided bright-scaled, silent reptiles. Toward sundown a small boat crept out and down along the shore, seeking and finding that which Conan desired, a Stygian fisherman in his shallow, flat-prowed boat. They brought him to the deck of the Venture, a tall, dark, rangily built man, ashy with fear of his captors, who were ogres of that coast. He was naked except for his silken breeks, for, like the Hyrcanians, even the commoners and slaves of Stygia wore silk, and in his boat was a wide mantle such as these fishermen flung about their shoulders against the chill of the night. He fell to his knees before Conan, expecting torture and death. "Stand on your legs, man, and quit trembling," said the Cimmerian impatiently, who found it difficult to understand abject terror. "You won't be harmed. Tell me but this, has a galley, a black racing galley returning from Argos, put into Kemi within the last few days?" "Aye, my lord," answered the fisherman. "Only yesterday at dawn the priest Thutathmes returned from a voyage far to the north. Men say he has been to Messensia." "What did he bring from Messensia?" "Alas, my lord, I know not." "Why did he go to Messensia?" demanded Conan. "Nay, my lord, I am but a common man. Who am I to know the minds of the priests of Set? I can only speak what I have seen and what I have heard men whisper along the wharves. Men say that news of great import came southward, though of what none knows, and it is well known that the Lord Thutathmes put off in his black galley in great haste. Now he is returned, but what he did in Argos, or what cargo he brought back, none knows, not even the seaman who manned his galley. Men say that he has opposed Thuthamon, who is the master of all priests of Set, and dwells in Lucker, and that Thutathmes seeks hidden power to overthrow the Great One. But who am I to say? When priests war with one another, a common man can but lie on his belly, and hope neither treads upon him. Conan snarled in nervous exasperation at this servile philosophy, and turned to his men. I'm going alone into Keme to find this thief Thutathmes. Keep this man prisoner, but see that you do him no hurt. Crom's devils, stop your yowling. Do you think we can sail into the harbor, and take the city by stun? I must go alone. Silencing the clamor of protests, he doffed his own garments and donned the prisoner's silk breeches and sandals, and the band from the man's hair, but scorned the short fisherman's knife. The common men of Stygia were not allowed to wear swords, and the mantle was not voluminous enough to hide the Cimmerian's long blade, but Conan buckled to his hip a Ganator knife, a weapon borne by the fierce desert men who dwelt to the south of the Stygians, a broad, heavy, slightly curved blade of fine steel, edged like a razor, and long enough to dismember a man. Then, leaving the Stygian guarded by the corsairs, Conan climbed into the fisher's boat. Wait for me until dawn, he said. If I haven't come then, I'll never come, so hasten southward to your own homes. As he clambered over the rail, they set up a doleful wail at his going, until he thnst his head back into sight to curse them into silence. Then, dropping into the boat, he grasped the oars and sent the tiny craft shooting over the waves more swiftly than its owner had ever propelled it. 17. He has slain the sacred son of Set. The harbor of Kemi lay between two great jutting points of land that ran into the ocean. He rounded the southern point, where the great black castles rose like a man-made hill, and entered the harbor just at dusk, when there was still enough light for the watchers to recognize the fisherman's boat and mantle, but not enough to permit recognition of betraying details. Unchallenged he threaded his way among the great black war galleys lying silent and unlighted at anchor, and drew up to a flight of wide stone steps which mounted up from the water's edge. There he made his boat fast to an iron ling set in the stone, as numerous similar craft were tied. There was nothing strange in a fisherman leaving his boat there. None but a fisherman could find a use for such a craft, and they did not steal from one another. No one cast him more than a casual glance as he mounted the long steps, unobtrusively avoiding the torches that flared at intervals above the lapping black water. He seemed but an ordinary, empty-handed fisherman, returning after a filletless day along the coast. If one had observed him closely, it might have seemed that his step was somewhat too springy and sure, his carriage somewhat too erect and confident for a lowly fisherman. But he passed quickly, keeping in the shadows, and the commoners of Stygia were no more given to analysis than were the commoners of the less exotic races. In build he was not unlike the warrior castes of the Stygians, who were a tall, muscular race. Bronzed by the sun, he was nearly as dark as many of them. His black hair, square-cut and confined by a copper band, increased the resemblance. The characteristics which set him apart from them were the subtle difference in his walk, and his alien features, and blue eyes. But the mantle was a good disguise, and he kept as much in the shadows as possible, turning away his head when a native passed him too closely. But it was a desperate game, and he knew he could not long keep up the deception. Kemi was not like the seaports of the Hyborians, where types of every race swarmed. The only aliens here were Negro and Shemite slaves, and he resembled neither even as much as he resembled the Stygians themselves. Strangers were not welcome in the cities of Stygia, tolerated only when they came as ambassadors or licensed traders. But even then the latter were not allowed ashore after dark. And now there were no Hyborian ships in the harbor at all. A strange restlessness ran through the city, a stirring of ancient ambitions, a whispering none could define except those who whispered. This Conan felt rather than knew, his whetted primitive instincts sensing unrest about him. If he were discovered, his fate would be ghastly. They would slay him merely for being a stranger. If he were recognized as Amra, the corsair chief who had swept their coasts with steel and flame, an involuntary shudder twitched Conan's broad shoulders. Human foes he did not fear, nor any death by steel or fire. But this was a black land of source one why, and nameless horror. Set the old serpent, men said, banished long ago from the Hyborian races, yet lurked in the shadows of the cryptic temples, and awful and mysterious were the deeds done in the night shrines. He had drawn away from the waterfront streets, with their broad steps leading down to the water, and was entering the long shadowy streets of the main part of the city. There was no such scene as was offered by any Hyborian city, no blaze of lamps and cressets, with gay-clad people laughing and strolling along the pavements, and shops and stalls wide open and displaying their wares. Here the stalls were closed at dusk. The only lights along the streets were torches, flaring smokily at wide intervals. People walking the streets were comparatively few, they went honey-eagerly and unspeaking, and their numbers decreased with the lateness of the hour. Conan found the scene gloomy and unreal, the silence of the people, their furtive haste, the great black stone walls that rose on each side of the streets. There was a grim massiveness about Stygian architecture that was overpowering and oppressive. Few lights showed anywhere except in the upper parts of the buildings. Conan knew that most of the people lay on the flat roofs, among the palms of artificial gardens under the stars. There was a murmur of weird music from somewhere. Occasionally a bronze chariot bled along the flags, and there was a brief glimpse of a tall, hawk-faced noble, with a silk cloak wrapped about him, and a gold band with a rearing serpent head emblem confining his black mane, of the ebon, naked charioteer bracing his knotty legs against the straining of the fierce Stygian horses. But the people who yet traversed the streets on foot were commoners, slaves, tradesmen, harlots, toilers, and they became fewer as he progressed. He was making toward the temple of Set, where he knew he would be likely to find the priest he sought. He believed he would know Thutathmes if he saw him, though his one glance had been in the semi-darkness of the Mesenteon alley. That the man he had seen there had been the priest he was certain. Only occultists high in the mazes of the hideous black ring possessed the power of the black hand that dealt death by its touch, and only such a man would dare Thutathmon, whom the Western world knew only as a figure of terror and myth. The street broadened, and Conan was aware that he was getting into the part of the city dedicated to the temples. The great structures reared their black bulks against the dim stars, grim, indescribably menacing in the flare of the few torches. And suddenly he heard a low scream from a woman on the other side of the street, and somewhat ahead of him, a naked courtesan wearing the tall plumed headdress of her class. She was shrinking back against the wall, staring across at something he could not yet see. At her cry the few people on the street halted suddenly as if frozen. At the same instant Conan was aware of a sinister slithering ahead of him. Then about the dark corner of the building he was approaching poked a hideous, wedge-shaped head, and after it flowed coil after coil of rippling, darkly glistening trunk. The Cimmerian recoiled, remembering tales he had heard. Serpents were sacred to Set, god of Stygia, who men said was himself a serpent. Monsters such as this were kept in the temples of Set, and when they hungered, were allowed to crawl on into the streets to take what prey they wished. Their ghastly feasts were considered a sacrifice to the scaly god. The Stygians within Conan's sight fell to their knees, men and women, and passively awaited their fate. One the great serpent would select, would lap in scaly coils, crush to a red pulp, and swallow, as a rat snake swallows a mouse. The others would live. That was the will of the gods. But it was not Conan's will. The python glided toward him, its attention probably attracted by the fact that he was the only human in sight still standing erect. Gripping his great knife under his mantle, Conan hoped the slimy brute would pass him by. But it halted before him and reared up horrifically in the flickering torchlight, its forked tongue flickering in and out, its cold eyes glittering with the ancient cruelty of the serpent folk. Its neck arched, but before it could dart, Conan whipped his knife from under his mantle, and snrck like a flicker of lightning. The broad blade split that wedge-shaped head, and sheared deep into the thick neck. Conan wrenched his knife free and sprang clear as the great body knotted and looped and whipped terrifically in its death throes. In the moment that he stood staring in morbid fascination, the only sound was the thud and swish of the snake's tail against the stones. Then from the shocked votaries burst a terrible cry, "Blasphemer! He has slain the sacred son of Set! Slay him! Slay! Slay!" Stones whizzed about him, and the crazed Stygians rushed at him, shrieking hysterically, while from all sides others emerged from their houses, and took up the cry. With a curse Conan wheeled and darted into the black mouth of an alley. He heard the patter of bare feet on the flags behind him as he ran, more by feel than by sight, and the walls resounded to the vengeful yells of the pursuers. Then his left hand found a break in the wall, and he tumbled sharply into another, narrower alley. On both sides rose sheer black stone walls. High above him he could see a thin line of stars. These giant walls, he knew, were the walls of temples. He heard, behind him, the pack sweep past the dark mouth in full cry. Their shouts grew distant, faded away. They had missed the smaller alley, and run straight on in the blackness. He too kept straight ahead, though the thought of encountering another of Set's sons in the darkness brought a shudder from him. Then somewhere ahead of him he caught a moving glow, like that of a crawling glowworm. He halted, flattened himself against the wall, and gripped his knife. He knew what it was, a man approaching with a torch. Now it was so close he could make out the dark hand that gripped it, and the dim oval of a dark face. A few more steps and the man would certainly see him. He sank into a tigerish crouch, the torch halted. A door was briefly etched in the glow, while the torch-bearer fumbled with it. Then it opened, the tall figure vanished through it, and darkness closed again on the alley. There was a sinister suggestion of furtiveness about that slinking figure, entering the alley door in darkness, a priest, perhaps, returning from some dark errand. But Conan groped toward the door. If one man came up that alley with a torch, others might come at any time. To retreat the way he had come might mean to run full into the mob from which he was fleeing. At any moment they might return, find the narrower alley, and come howling down it. He felt hemmed in by those sheer, unscalable walls, desirous of escape, even if escape meant invading some unknown building. The heavy bronze door was not locked. It opened under his fingers, and he peered through the crack. He was looking into a great square chamber of massive black stone. A torch smoldered in a niche in the wall. The chamber was empty. He glided through the lacquered door, and closed it behind him. His sandaled feet made no sound as he crossed the black marble floor. A teak door stood partly open, and gliding through this, knife in hand, he came out into a great, dim, shadowy place whose lofty ceiling was only a hint of darkness high above him, toward which the black walls swept upward. On all sides black arched doorways opened into the great still hall. It was lit by curious bronze lamps that gave a dim weird light. On the other side of the great hall a broad black marble stairway, without a railing, marched upward to lose itself in gloom, and above him on all sides dim galleries hung like black stone ledgers. Conan shivered. He was in a temple of some Stygian god, if not Set himself, then someone barely less grim. And the shrine did not lack an occupant. In the midst of the great hall stood a black stone altar, massive, sombre, without carvings or ornament, and upon it coiled one of the great sacred cements, its iridescent scales shimmering in the lamplight. It did not move, and Conan remembered stories that the priests kept these creatures drugged part of the time. The Cimmerian took an uncertain step out from the door, then shrank back suddenly, not into the room he had just quitted, but into a velvet-curtained recess. He had heard a soft step somewhere nearby. From one of the black arches emerged a tall, powerful figure in sandals and silken loincloth, with a wide mantle trailing from his shoulders. But face and head were hidden by a monstrous mask, a half-bestial, half-human countenance, from the crest of which floated a mass of ostrich plumes. In certain ceremonies the Stygian priests went masked. Conan hoped the man would not discover him, but some instinct warned the Stygian. He turned abruptly from his destination, which apparently was the stair, and stepped straight to the recess. As he jerked aside the velvet hanging, a hand darted from the shadows, crushed the crier in his throat, and jerked him headlong into the alcove, and the knife impaled him. Conan's next move was the obvious one suggested by logic. He lifted off the grinning mask, and drew it over his own head. The fisherman's mantle he flung over the body of the priest, which he concealed behind the hangings, and drew the priestly mantle about his own brawny shoulders. Fate had given him a disguise. All Kemi might well be searching now for the blasphemer who dared defend himself against a sacred snake, but who would dream of looking for him under the mask of a priest? He strode boldly from the alcove and headed for one of the arched doorways at random, but he had not taken a dozen strides when he wheeled again, all his senses edged for peril. A band of masked figures filed down the stair, apparelled exactly as he was. He hesitated, caught in the open, and stood still, listening to his disguise, though cold sweat gathered on his forehead and the backs of his hands. No word was spoken. Like phantoms they descended into the great hall, and moved past him toward a black arch. The leader carried an ebon staff which supported a grinning white skull, and Conan knew it was one of the ritualistic processions so inexplicable to a foreigner, but which played a strong, and often sinister, part in the Stygian religion. The last figure turned his head slightly toward the motionless Cimmerian, as if expecting him to follow. Not to do what was obviously expected of him would rouse instant suspicion. Conan fell in behind the last man, and suited his gait to their measured pace. They traversed a long, dark, vaulted corridor in which, Conan noticed uneasily, the skull on the staff glowed phosphorescently. He felt a surge of unreasoning, wild animal panic that urged him to rip out his knife, and slash right and left at these uncanny figures, to flee madly from the grim, dark temple. But he held himself in check, fighting down the dim monstrous intuitions that rose in the back of his mind, and peopled the gloom with shadowy shapes of horror, and presently he barely stifled a sigh of relief, as they filed through a great double-valved door, which was 3 times higher than a man, and emerged into the starlight. Conan wondered if he dared fade into some dark alley, but hesitated, uncertain, and down the long dark street they padded silently, while such folk as they met turned their heads away and fled from them. The procession kept far out from the walls. To turn and bolt into any of the alleys they passed would be too conspicuous. While he mentally fumed and cursed, they came to a low arched gateway in the southern wall, and through this they filed. Ahead of them and about them lay clusters of low, flat-topped mud houses, and palm groves, shadowy in the starlight. Now if ever, thought Conan, was his time to escape his silent companions. But the moment the gate was left behind them those companions were no longer silent. They began to mutter excitedly among themselves. The measured, ritualistic gate was abandoned, the staff with its skull was tucked unceremoniously under the leader's arm, and the whole group broke ranks and hurried onward. And Conan hurried with them. For in the low manner of speech he had caught a word that galvanized him. The word was, Thutathms. 18 I am the woman who never died. Conan stared with burning interest at his masked companions. One of them was Thutathms, or else the destination of the band was a rendezvous with the man he sought. And he knew what that destination was, when beyond the palms he glimpsed a black triangular bulk looming against the shadowy sky. They passed through the belt of huts and groves, and if any man saw them he was careful not to show himself. The huts were dark. Behind them the black towers of Kemi rose gloomily against the stars that were mirrored in the waters of the harbor. Ahead of them the desert stretched away in dim darkness, somewhere a jackal yapped. The quick passing sandals of the silent neophytes made no noise in the sand. They might have been ghosts, moving toward that colossal pyramid that rose out of the murk of the desert. There was no sound over all the sleeping land. Conan's heart beat quicker as he gazed at the grim black wedge that stood etched against the stars, and his impatience to close with futile thumbs in whatever conflict the meeting might mean was not unmixed with a fear of the unknown. No man could approach one of those somber piles of black stone without apprehension. The very name was a symbol of repellent horror among the northern nations, and legends hinted that the Stygians did not build them, that they were in the land at whatever immeasurably ancient date the dark-skinned people came into the land of the great river. As they approached the pyramid he glimpsed a dim glow near the base, which presently resolved itself into a doorway, on either side of which brooded stone lions with the heads of women, cryptic, inscrutable, nightmares crystallized in stone. The leader of the band made straight for the doorway, in the deep well of which Conan saw a shadowy figure. The leader paused an instant beside this dim figure, and then vanished into the dark interior, and one by one the others followed. As each masked priest passed through the gloomy portal he was halted briefly by the mysterious guardian, and something passed between them, some word or gesture Conan could not make out. Seeing this, the Cimmerian Pumosely lagged behind, and stooping, pretended to be fumbling with the fastening of his sandal. Not until the last of the masked figures had disappeared did he straighten and approach the portal. He was uneasily wondering if the guardian of the temple were human, remembering some tales he had heard. But his doubts were set at rest. A dim bronze crescent glowing just within the door lighted a long narrow corridor that ran away into blackness, and a man standing silent in the mouth of it, wrapped in a wide black cloak. No one else was in sight. Obviously the masked priests had disappeared down the corridor. Over the cloak that was drawn about his lower features, the Stygian's piercing eyes regarded Conan sharply. With his left hand he made a curious gesture. On a venture Conan imitated it. But evidently another gesture was expected. The Stygian's right hand came from under his cloak, with a gleam of steel, and his murderous stab would have pierced the heart of an ordinary, but he was dealing with one whose thews were nerved to the quickness of a jungle cat. Even as the dagger flashed in the dim light, Conan caught the dusky wrist, and smashed his clenched right fist against the Stygian's jaw. The man's head went back against the stone wall, with a dull crunch that told of a fractured skull. Standing for an instant above him, Conan listened intently. The crescent burned low, casting vague shadows about the door. Nothing stirred in the blackness beyond, though far away and below him, as it seemed, he caught the faint, muffled note of a gong. He stooped and dragged the body behind the great bronze door which stood wide, opened inward, and then the Cimmerian went warily but swiftly down the corridor, toward what doom he did not even try to guess. He had not gone far when he halted, baffled. The corridor split in two branches, and he had no way of knowing which the masked priests had taken. At a venture he chose the left. The floor slanted slightly downward and was worn smooth as by many feet. Here and there a dim crescent cast a faint nightmarish twilight. Conan wondered uneasily for what purpose these colossal piles had been reared, in what forgotten age. This was an ancient land. No man knew how many ages the black temples of Stygia had looked against the stars. Narrow black arches opened occasionally to right and left, but he kept to the main corridor, although a conviction that he had taken the wrong branch was growing in him. Even with their start on him, he should have overtaken the priests by this time. He was growing nervous. The silence was like a tangible thing, and yet he had a feeling that he was not alone. More than once, passing a night arch, he seemed to feel the glare of unseen eyes fixed upon him. He paused, half-minded to turn back to where the corridor had first branched. He wheeled abruptly, knife lifted, every nerve tingling. A girl stood at the mouth of a smaller tunnel, staring fixedly at him. Her ivory skin showed her to be Stygian of some ancient noble family, and like all such women she was tall, lithe, voluptuously figured, her hair a great pile of black foam, among which gleamed a sparkling ruby. But for her velvet sandals, and broad jewel-crusted girdle about her supple waist, she was quite nude. "What do you here?" she demanded. To answer would betray his alien origin. He remained motionless, a grim, somber figure in the hideous mask with the plumes floating over him. His alert gaze sought the shadows behind her, and found them empty. But there might be hordes of fighting men within her call. She advanced toward him, apparently without apprehension though with suspicion. "You are not a priest," she said. "You are a fighting man. Even with that mask, that is plain. There is as much difference between you and a priest as there is between a man and a woman." "By Set," she exclaimed, halting suddenly, her eyes flaring wide. "I do not believe you are even a Stygian." With a movement too quick for the eye to follow, his hand closed about her round throat, lightly as a caress. "Not a sound out of you," he muttered. Her smooth ivory flesh was cold as marble, yet there was no fear in the wide, dark, marvelous eyes which regarded him. "Do not fear," she answered calmly. "El will not betray you." "But are you mad to come, a stranger and a foreigner, to the forbidden temple of Set?" "I'm looking for the priest Book.2-2, he answered. "Is he in this temple?" "Why do you seek him?" she parried. "Tool has something of mine which was stolen." "I will lead you to him," she volunteered so promptly that his suspicions were instantly roused. "Don't play with me, girl," he growled. "El do not play with you. I have no love for Book.2-2. He hesitated, then made up his mind. After all, he was as much in her power as she was in his. "Walk beside me," he commanded, shifting his grasp from her throat to her wrist. "But walk with care. If you make a suspicious move," she led him down the slanting corridor, down and down, until there were no more cressets, and he groped his way in darkness, aware less by sight than by feel and sense of the woman at his side. Once when he spoke to her, she turned her head toward him, and he was startled to see her eyes glowing like golden fire in the dark. Dim doubts and vague monstrous suspicions haunted his mind, but he followed her, through a labyrinthine maze of black corridors that confused even his primitive sense of direction. He mentally cursed himself for a fool, allowing himself to be led into that black abode of mystery, but it was too late to turn back now. Again he felt life and movement in the darkness about him, sensed peril and hunger burning impatiently in the blackness. Unless his ears deceived him, he caught a faint sliding noise that ceased and receded at a muttered command from the girl. She led him at last into a chamber lighted by a curious seven-branched candelabrum in which black candles bummed weirdly. He knew they were far below the earth. The chamber was square, with walls and ceiling of polished black marble, and furnished in the manner of the ancient Stygians. There was a couch of ebony, covered with black velvet, and on a black stone dais lay a carven mummy case. Conan stood waiting expectantly, staring at the various black arches which opened into the chamber. But the girl made no move to go farther. Stretching herself on the couch with feline suppleness, she intertwined her fingers behind her sleek head, and regarded him from under long drooping lashes. "Well," he demanded impatiently. "What are you doing? Where's Book.2-2? "There is no haste," she answered lazily. "What is an hour, or a day, or a year, or a century, for that matter? Take off your mask. Let me see your features." With a grunt of annoyance, Conan dragged off the bulky headpiece, and the girl nodded as if in approval as she scanned his dark scarred face and blazing eyes. "There is strength in you, great strength. You could strangle a bullock." He moved restlessly, his suspicion growing. With his hand on his hilt, he peered into the gloomy arches. "If you've brought me into a trap," he said, "you won't live to enjoy your handiwork. Are you going to get off that couch and do as you promised, or do I have to?" His voice trailed away. He was staring at the mummy case, on which the countenance of the occupant was carved in ivory, with the startling vividness of a forgotten art. There was a disquieting familiarity about that carven mask, and with something of a shock he realized what it was. There was a startling resemblance between it and the face of the girl lolling on the ebon couch. She might have been the model from which it was carved, but he knew the portrait was at least centuries old. Archaic hieroglyphics were scrawled across the lacquered lid, and, seeking back into his mind for tag ends of learning, picked up here and there as incidentals of an adventurous life, he spelled them out, and said aloud, "Akiva Shah." "You have heard of Princess Akiva Shah?" inquired the girl on the couch. "Who hasn't?" he grunted. The name of that ancient, evil, beautiful princess still lived the world over in song and legend, though 10,000 years had rolled their cycles since the daughter of Tutaman had reveled in purple feasts amid the black halls of ancient Lakur. Her only sin was that she loved life, and all the meanings of life, said the Stygian girl. To win life she courted death. She could not bear to think of growing old and shriveled and worn, and dying at last as hags die. She wooed darkness like a lover, and his gift was life, life that, not being life as mortals know it, can never grow old and fade. She went into the shadows to cheat age and death. Conan glared at her with eyes that were suddenly burning slits. And he wheeled and tore the lid from the sarcophagus. It was empty. Behind him the girl was laughing, and the sound froze the blood in his veins. He whirled back to her, the short hairs on his neck bristling. "You are Akiva Shah," he grated. She laughed and shook back her burnished locks, spread her arms sensuously. "I am Akiva Shah. I am the woman who never died, who never grew old. Who fools say was lifted from the earth by the gods, in the full bloom of her youth and beauty, to queen it forever in some celestial clime. Nay, it is in the shadows that monals find immortality. 10,000 years ago I died to live forever. Give me your lips, strong man." Rising lithely she came to him, rose on tiptoe and flung her arms about his massive neck. Scowling down into her upturned, beautiful countenance, he was aware of a fearful fascination, and an icy fear. "Love me," she whispered, her head thrown back, eyes closed and lips parted. "Give me of your blood to renew my youth, and perpetuate my everlasting life. I will make you, too, immortal. I will teach you the wisdom of all the ages, all the secrets that have lasted out the eons in the blackness beneath these dark temples. I will make you king of that shadowy horde, which revels among the tombs of the ancients, when night veils the desert, and bats flit across the moon. I am weary of priests and magicians, and captive girls dragged screaming through the portals of death. I desire a man. Love me, barbarian." She pressed her dark head down against his mighty breast, and he felt a sharp pang at the base of his throat. With a curse he tore her away and flung her sprawling across the couch. Damned vampire. Blood was trickling from a tiny wound in his throat. She reared up on the couch like a serpent poised to strike, all the golden fires of hell blazing in her wide eyes. Her lips drew back, revealing white pointed teeth. "Tool," she shrieked. "Do you think to escape me? You will live and die in darkness. I have brought you far below the temple. You can never find your way out alone. You can never cut your way through those which guard the tunnels. But for my protection the sons of Set would long ago have taken you into their bellies. Fool, I shall yet drink your blood. Keep away from me or I'll slash you asunder," he muttered, his flesh crawling with revulsion. "You may be immortal, but steel will dismember you." As he backed toward the arch through which he had entered, the light went out suddenly. All the candles were extinguished at once, though he did not know how, for Akiva Shah had not touched them. But the vampire's laugh rose mockingly behind him, poison sweet as the vials of hell, and he sweated as he groped in the darkness for the arch in a near panic. His fingers encountered an opening, and he plunged through it. Whether it was the arch through which he had entered he did not know, nor did he very much care. His one thought was to get out of the haunted chamber which had housed that beautiful, hideous, undead fiend for so many centuries. His wanderings through those black, winding tunnels were a sweating nightmare. Behind him and about him he heard faint slitherings and glidings, and once the echo of that sweet, hellish laughter he had heard in the chamber of Akiva Shah. He slashed ferociously at sounds and movements he heard or imagined he heard in the darkness near him, and once his sword cut through some yielding tenuous substance that might have been cobwebs. He had a desperate feeling that he was being played with, lured deeper and deeper into ultimate night, before being set upon by demoniac talon and fang. And through his fear ran the sickening revulsion of his discovery. The legend of Akiva Shah was so old, and among the evil tales told of her ran a thread of beauty and idealism, of everlasting youth. To so many dreamers and poets and lovers she was not alone the evil princess of Stygian legend, but the symbol of eternal youth and beauty, shining forever in some far realm of the gods. And this was the hideous reality. This foul perversion was the TNLTH of that everlasting life. Through his physical revulsion ran the sense of a shattered dream of man's idolatry, its glittering gold-proved slime and cosmic filth. A wave of futility swept over him, a dim fear of the falseness of all men's dreams and idolatries. And now he knew that his ears were not playing him tricks. He was being followed, and his pursuers were closing in on him. In the darkness sounded shufflings and slidings that were never made by human feet, no, nor by the feet of any normal animal. The underworld had its bestial life too, perhaps. They were behind him. He turned to face them, though he could see nothing, and slowly backed away. Then the sounds ceased, even before he turned his head and saw, somewhere down the long corridor, a glow of light. 19. In the Hall of the Dead. Conan moved cautiously in the direction of the light he had seen, his ear cocked over his shoulder, but there was no further sound of pursuit, though he felt the darkness pregnant with sentient life. The glow was not stationary, it moved, bobbing grotesquely along. Then he saw the source. The tunnel he was traversing crossed another, wider corridor some distance ahead of him. And along this latter tunnel filed a bizarre procession, 4 tall, gaunt men in black, hooded robes, leaning on staffs. The leader held a torch above his head, a torch that burned with a curious steady glow. Like phantoms they passed across his limited range of vision and vanished, with only a fading glow to tell of their passing. Their appearance was indescribably eldritch. They were not Stygians, not like anything Conan had ever seen. He doubted if they were even humans. They were like black ghosts, stalking ghoulishly along the haunted tunnels. But his position could be no more desperate than it was. Before the inhuman feet behind him could resume their slithering advance, at the fading of the distant illumination, Conan was running down the corridor. He plunged into the other tunnel and saw, far down it, small in the distance, the weird procession moving in the glowing sphere. He stole noiselessly after them, then shrank suddenly back against the wall as he saw them halt and clustered together as if conferring on some matter. They turned as if to retrace their steps, and he slipped into the nearest archway. Groping in the darkness to which he had become so accustomed that he could all but see through it, he discovered that the tunnel did not straight, but meandered, and he fell back beyond the first turn, so that the light of the strangers should not fall on him as they passed. But as he stood there, he was aware of a low hum of sound from somewhere behind him, like the murmur of human voices. Moving down the corridor in that direction, he confirmed his first suspicion. Abandoning his original intention of following the ghoulish travelers to whatever destination might be theirs, he set out in the direction of the voices. Presently he saw a glint of light ahead of him, and turning into the corridor from which it issued, saw a broad arch filled with a dim glow at the other end. On his left a narrow stone stair went upward, and instinctive caution prompted him to turn and mount the stair. The voices he heard were coming from beyond that flame-filled arch. The sounds fell away beneath him as he climbed, and presently he came out through a low arched door into a vast open space glowing with a weird radiance. He was standing on a shadowy gallery from which he looked down into a broad dim-lit hall of colossal proportions. It was a hall of the dead, which few ever see but the silent priests of Stygia. Along the black walls rose tier above tier of carven, painted sarcophagi. Each stood in a niche in the dusky stone, and the tiers mounted up and up to be lost in the gloom above. Thousands of carven masks stared impassively down upon the group in the midst of the hall, rendered futile and insignificant by that vast array of the dead. Of this group 10 were priests, and though they had discarded their masks, Conan knew they were the priests he had accompanied to the Pwite mead. They stood before a tall, hawk-faced man beside a black altar on which lay a mummy in rotting swathings. And the altar seemed to stand in the hilt of a living fire, which pulsed and shimmered, dripping flakes of quivering golden flame on the black stones about it. This dazzling glow emanated from a great red jewel which lay upon the altar, and in the reflection of which the faces of the priests looked ashy and corpse-like. As he looked, Conan felt the pressure of all the wean leagues, and the weary nights and days of his long quest, and he trembled with a mad urge to rush among those silent priests, clear his way with mighty blows of naked steel, and grasp the red gem with passion-taut fingers. But he gripped himself with iron control, and crouched down in the shadow of the stone balustrade. A glance showed him that a stair led down into the hall from the gallery, hugging the wall and half hidden in the shadows. He glared into the thinness of the vast place, seeking other priests or votaries, but saw only the group about the altar. In that great emptiness the voice of the man beside the altar sounded hollow and ghostly, and so the word came southward. The night wind whispered it, the ravens croaked of it as they flew, and the grim bats told it to the owls and the cements that lurk in hoary ruins. Werewolf and vampire knew, and the ebon-bodied demons that prowl by night. The sleeping night of the world stirred and shook its heavy mane, and there began a throbbing of drums in deep darkness, and the echoes of far weird cries frightened men who walked by dusk. For the heart of Ahriman had come again into the world to fulfill its cryptic destiny. Ask me not how I, Thutathms of Kemi and the Night, heard the word before Thuthamon, who calls himself Prince of all Wizards. There are secrets not meet for such ears even as yours, and Thuthamon is not the only lord of the Black Ring. El knew, and I went to meet the heart which came southward. It was like a magnet which drew me, unerringly. From death to death it came, riding on a river of human blood. Blood feeds it, blood draws it. Its power is greatest when there is blood on the hands that grasp it, when it is wrested by slaughter from its holder. Wherever it gleams, blood is spilt and kingdoms totter, and the forces of nature are put in turmoil. And here I stand, the master of the heart, and have summoned you to come secretly, who are faithful to me, to share in the black kingdom that shall be. Tonight you shall witness the breaking of Thuthamon's chains which enslave us, and the birth of empire. Who am I, even I, Thutathms, to know what powers lurk and dream in those crimson deeps? It holds secrets forgotten for 3,000 years. But I shall learn. These shall tell me. He waved his hand toward the silent shapes that lined the hall. See how they sleep, staring through their carven masks. Kings, queens, generals, priests, wizards, the dynasties and the nobility of Stygia for 10,000 years. The touch of the heart will awaken them from their long slumber. Long, long the heart throbbed and pulsed in ancient Stygia. Here was its home in the centuries before it journeyed to Icheron. The ancients knew its full power, and they will tell me when by its magic I restore them to life to labor for me. El will rouse them, will waken them, will learn their forgotten wisdom, the knowledge locked in those withered skulls. By the law of the dead we shall enslave the living. I, kings and generals and wizards of old shall be our helpers, and our slaves. Who shall stand before us? Look. This dried, shriveled thing on the altar was once Thuthmakri, a high priest of Set, who died 3,000 years ago. He was an adept of the Black Ring. He knew of the heart. He will tell us of its powers. Lifting the great jewel, the speaker laid it on the withered breast of the mummy, and lifted his hand as he began an incantation. But the incantation was never finished. with his hand lifted and his lips parted he froze, glaring past his acolytes, and they wheeled to stare in the direction in which he was looking. Through the black arch of a door 4 gaunt, black-robed shapes had filed into the great hall. Their faces were dim yellow ovals in the shadow of their hoods. "Who are you?" ejaculated Thutathmes in a voice as pregnant with danger as the hiss of a cobra. "Are you mad, to invade the holy shrine of Set?" The tallest of the strangers spoke, and his voice was toneless as a hidden temple bell. "We follow Conan of Aquilonia." "He is not here," answered Thutathmes, shaking back his mantle from his right hand with a curious menacing gesture, like a panther unsheathing his talons. "You lie. He is in this temple. We tracked him from a corpse behind the bronze door of the outer portal through a maze of corridors. We were following his devious trail when we became aware of this conclave. We go now to take it up again. But first give us the heart of Ahriman." "Death is the portion of madmen," murmured Thutathmes, moving nearer the speaker. His priests closed in on cat-like feet, but the strangers did not appear to heed. "Who can look upon it without desire?" said the Khitan. "In Khitai we have heard of it. It will give us power over the people which cast us out. Glory and wonder dream in its crimson deeps. Give it to us, before we slay you." A fierce cry rang out as a priest leaped with a flicker of steel. Before he could strike, a scaly staff licked out and touched his breast, and he fell as a dead man falls. In an instant the mummies were staring down on a scene of blood and horror. Curved knives flashed and crimsoned, snaky staffs licked in and out, and whenever they touched a man, that man screamed and died. At the first stroke Conan had bounded up and was racing down the stairs. He caught only glimpses of that brief, fiendish fight, saw men swaying, locked in battle and streaming blood, saw one Khitan, fairly hacked to pieces, yet still on his feet and dealing death, when Thutathmes smote him on the breast with his open empty hand, and he dropped dead, though naked steel had not been enough to destroy his uncanny vitality. By the time Conan's hurtling feet left the stair, the fight was all but over. 3 of the Khitans were down, slashed and cut to ribbons and disemboweled, but of the Stygians only Thutathmes remained on his feet. He mshed at the remaining Khitan, his empty hand lifted like a weapon, and that hand was black as that of a Negro. But before he could strike, the staff in the tall Khitan's hand licked out, seeming to elongate itself as the yellow man thrust. The point touched the bosom of Thutathmes, and he staggered. Again and yet again the staff licked out, and Thutathmes reeled and fell dead, his features blotted out in a rush of blackness that made the whole of him the same hue as his enchanted hand. The Khitan tumbled toward the jewel that burned on the breast of the mummy, but Conan was before him. In a tense stillness the two faced each other, amid that shambles, with the carven mummies staring down upon them. "Far have I followed you, O King of Aquilonia," said the Khitan calmly. "Down the long river, and over the mountains, across Poitine and Singara, and through the hills of Argos, and down the coast. Not easily did we pick up your trail from Turanshia, for the priests of Asura are crafty. We lost it in Singara, but we found your helmet in the forest below the border hills, where you had fought with the ghouls of the forests. Almost we lost the trail again tonight among these labyrinths." Conan reflected that he had been fortunate in returning from the vampire's chamber by another route than that by which he had been led to it. Otherwise he would have run full into these yellow fiends instead of sighting them from afar as they smelled out his spoil like human bloodhounds, with whatever uncanny gift was theirs. The Khitan shook his head slightly, as if reading his mind. "That is meaningless, the long trail ends here." "Why have you hounded me?" demanded Conan, poised to move in any direction with the celerity of a hair-trigger. "It was a debt to pay," answered the Khitan. "To you who are about to die, I will not withhold knowledge. We were vassals of the king of Aquilonia, Valorous. Long we served him, but of that service we are free now, my brothers by death, and I by the fulfillment of obligation. I shall return to Aquilonia with 2 hefts, for myself the heart of Ahriman, for Valorous the heart of Conan. A kiss of the staff that was cut from the living tree of death. The staff licked out like the dart of a viper, but the slash of Conan's knife was quicker. The staff fell in writhing halves, there was another flicker of the keen steel like a jet of lightning, and the head of the kitten rolled to the floor. Conan wheeled and extended his hand toward the jewel, then he shrank back, his hair bristling, his blood congealing icily. For no longer a withered brown thing lay on the altar. The jewel shimmered on the full, arching breast of a naked, living man who lay among the molding bandages. Living? Conan could not decide. The eyes were like dark murky glass under which shone inhuman summer fires. Slowly the man rose, taking the jewel in his hand. He towered beside the altar, dusky, naked, with a face like a Korean image. Mutely he extended his hand toward Conan, with the jewel throbbing like a living heart within it. Conan took it, with an eerie sensation of receiving gifts from the hand of the dead. He somehow realized that the proper incantations had not been made, the conjurement had not been completed, life had not been fully restored to his corpse. "Who are you?" demanded the Cimmerian. The answer came in a toneless monotone, like the dripping of water from stalactites in subterranean caverns. "I was Thuthmakri, I am dead." "Well, lead me out of this accursed temple, will you?" Conan requested, his flesh crawling. With measured, mechanical steps the dead man moved toward a black arch. Conan followed him. A glance back showed him once again the vast, shadowy hall with its tiers of sarcophagi, the dead men sprawled about the altar, the head of the kitten he had slain stared sightless up at the sweeping shadows. The glow of the jewel illuminated the black tunnels like an ensorcelled lamp, dripping golden fire. Once Conan caught a glimpse of ivory flesh in the shadows, believed he saw the vampire that was Akiva Shah shrinking back from the glow of the jewel, and with her, other less human shapes scuttled or shambled into the darkness. The dead man strode straight on, looking neither to right nor left, his pace as changeless as the tramp of doom. Cold sweat gathered thick on Conan's flesh. Icy doubts assailed him. How could he know that this terrible figure out of the past was leading him to freedom? But he knew that, left to himself, he could never untangle this bewitched maze of corridors and tunnels. He followed his awful guide through blackness that loomed before and behind them and was filled with skulking shapes of horror and lunacy that cringed from the blinding glow of the hilt. Then the bronze doorway was before him, and Conan felt the night wind blowing across the desert, and saw the stars, and the starlit desert across which streamed the great black shadow of the pyramid. Thuthmakri pointed silently into the desert, and then turned and stalked soundlessly back in the darkness. Conan stared after that silent figure that receded into the blackness on soundless, inexorable feet as one that moves to a known and inevitable doom, or returns to everlasting sleep. With a curse the Cimmerian leaped from the doorway and fled into the desert, as if pursued by demons. He did not look back toward the pyramid, or toward the black towers of Keme looming dimly across the sands. He headed southward toward the coast, and he ran as a man NMS in ungovernable panic. The violent exertion shook his brain free of black cobwebs, the clean desert wind blew the nightmares from his soul, and his revulsion changed to a wild tide of exultation before the desert gave way to a tangle of swampy growth through which he saw the black water lying before him, and the Venture at anchor. He plunged through the undergrowth, hip-deep in the marshes, dived headlong into the deep water, heedless of sharks or crocodiles, and swam to the galley, and was clambering up the chain onto the deck, dripping and exultant, before the watch saw him. "Awake, you dogs!" roared Conan, knocking aside the spear the startled lookout thrust at his breast. "Heave up the anchor. Lay to the doors. Give that fisherman a helmet full of gold, and put him ashore. Dawn will soon be breaking, and before sunrise we must be racing for the nearest port of Zingara." He whirled about his head the great jewel, which threw off splashes of light that spotted the deck with golden fire. 20. Out of the dust shall Icharon arise? Winter had passed from Aquilonia. Leaves sprang out on the limbs of trees, and the fresh grass smiled to the touch of the warm southern breezes. But many a field lay idle and empty, many a charred heap of ashes marked the spot where proud villas or prosperous towns had stood. Wolves prowled openly along the grass-grown highways, and bands of gaunt, masterless men slunk through the forests. Only in Turantia was feasting and wealth and pageantry. Valorous ruled like one touched with madness. Even many of the barons who had welcomed his return cried out at last against him. His tax-gatherers crushed rich and poor alike, the wealth of a looted kingdom poured into Turantia, which became less like the capital of a realm than the garrison of conquerors in a conquered land. Its merchants waxed rich, but it was a precarious prosperity, for none knew when he might be accused of treason on a trump-up charge, and his property confiscated, himself cast into prison or brought to the bloody block. Valorous made no attempt to conciliate his subjects. He maintained himself by means of the Numidian soldiery, and by desperate mercenaries. He knew himself to be a puppet of Amalric. He knew that he ruled only on the sufferance of the Numidian. He knew that he could never hope to unite Aquilonia under his rule, and cast off the yoke of his masters, for the outland provinces would resist him to the last drop of blood. And for that matter the Numidians would cast him from his throne if he made any attempt to consolidate his kingdom. He was caught in his own vice. The gall of defeated pride corroded his soul, and he threw himself into a reign of debauchery, as one who lives from day to day, without thought or care for tomorrow. Yet there was subtlety in his madness, so deep that not even Amalric guessed it. Perhaps the wild, chaotic years of wandering as an exile had bred in him a bitterness beyond common conception. Perhaps his loathing of his present position increased this bitterness to a kind of madness. At any event he lived with one desire, to cause the ruin of all who associated with. He knew that his rule would be over the instant he had served Amalric's purpose. He knew, too, that so long as he continued to oppress his native kingdom the Numidian would suffer him to reign, for Amalric wished to crush Aquilonia into ultimate submission, to destroy its last shred of independence, and then at last to seize it himself, rebuild it after his own fashion with his vast wealth, and use its men and natural resources to wrest the crown of Numidia from Tarascus. For the throne of an emperor was Amalric's ultimate ambition, and Valorous knew it. Valorous did not know whether Tarascus suspected this, but he knew that the king of Numidia approved of his ruthless course. Tarascus hated Aquilonia, with a hate born of old wars. He desired only the destruction of the western kingdom. And Valorous intended to ruin the country so utterly that not even Amalric's wealth could ever rebuild it. He hated the Baron quite as much as he hated the Aquilonians, and hoped only to live to see the day when Aquilonia lay in utter ruin, and Tarascus and Amalric were locked in hopeless civil war that would as completely destroy Numidia. He believed that the conquest of the still defiant provinces of Gundeland and Poitine and the Bossonian marches would mark his end as king. He would then have served Amalric's purpose, and could be discarded. So he delayed the conquest of these provinces, confining his activities to objectless raids and forays, meeting Amalric's urges for action with all sorts of plausible objections and postponements. His life was a series of feasts and wild debauches. He filled his palace with the fairest girls of the kingdom, willing or unwilling. He blasphemed the gods and sprawled drunken on the floor of the banquet hall wearing the golden crown, and staining his royal purple robes with the wine he spilled. In gusts of bloodlust he festooned the gallows in the market square with dangling corpses, glutted the axes of the headsmen, and sent his Numidian horsemen thundering through the land pillaging and burning. Driven to madness, the land was in a constant upheaval of frantic revolt, savagely suppressed. Valorous plundered and raped and looted and destroyed until even Amalric protested, warning him that he would beggar the kingdom beyond repair, not knowing that such was his fixed determination. But while in both Aquilonia and Numidia men talked of the madness of the king, in Numidia men talked much of Zultotun, the masked one. Yet few saw him on the streets of Belvis. Men said he spent much time in the hills, in curious conclaves with surviving remnants of an old race, dark, silent folk who claimed descent from an ancient kingdom. Men whispered of drums beating far up in the dreaming hills, of fires glowing in the darkness, and strange chantings borne on the winds, chantings and rituals forgotten centuries ago except as meaningless formulas mumbled beside mountain hearths in villages whose inhabitants differed strangely from the people of the valleys. The reason for these conclaves none knew, unless it was Orest's, who frequently accompanied the Pythonian, and on whose countenance a haggard shadow was growing. But in the full flood of spring a sudden whisper passed over the sinking kingdom that woke the land to eager life. It came like a murmurous wind drifting up from the south, waking men sunk in the apathy of despair. Yet how it first came none could tell say. Some spoke of a strange, grim old woman who came down from the mountains with her hair flowing in the wind, and a great grey wolf following her like a dog. Others whispered of the priests of Asura who stole like furtive phantoms from Gunderland to the marches of Poityne, and to the forest villages of the Bossonians. However the word came, revolt ran like a flame along the borders. Outlying Numidian garrisons were stunned and put to the sword, foraging parties were cut to pieces, the West was up in arms, and there was a different air about the rising, a fierce resolution and inspired wrath rather than the frantic despair that had motivated the preceding revolts. It was not only the common people, barons were fortifying their castles and hurling defiance at the governors of the provinces. Bands of Bossonians were seen moving along the edges of the marches, stocky, resolute men in brigandines and steel caps, with longbows in their hands. From the inert stagnation of dissolution and ruin the realm was suddenly alive, vibrant and dangerous. So Amalric sent in haste for Tarascus, who came with an army. In the royal palace in Turantia the two kings and Amalric discussed the rising. They had not sent for Zultotan, immersed in his cryptic studies in the Numidian hills. Not since that bloody day in the valley of the Valkyr had they called upon him for aid of his magic, and he had drawn apart, communing but little with them, apparently indifferent to their intrigues. Nor had they sent for hastes, but he came, and he was white as spume blown before the storm. He stood in the gold-domed chamber where the kings held conclave, and they beheld in amazement his haggard stare, the fear they had never guessed the mind of Orest's could hold. "You are weary," Orest said Amalric. "Sit upon this divan and I will have a slave fetch you wine." "You have ridden hard," Hastes waved aside the invitation. "I have killed 3 horses on the road from Belvendals. I cannot drink wine, I cannot rest, until I have said what I have to say." He paced back and forth as if some inner fire would not let him stand motionless, and halting before his wondering companions, "When we employed the heart of Ahriman to bring a dead man back to life," Orest said abruptly, "we did not weigh the consequences of tampering in the black dust of the past. The fault is mine, and the sin. We thought only of our ambitions, forgetting what ambitions this man might himself have. And we have loosed a demon upon the earth, a fiend inexplicable to common humanity. I have plumbed deep in evil, but there is a limit to which I, or any man of my race and age, can go. My ancestors were clean men, without any demoniacal taint. It is only I who have sunk into the pits, and I can sin only to the extent of my personal individuality. But behind Zultotan lie 1,000 centuries of black magic and diabolism, an ancient tradition of evil. He is beyond our conception not only because he is a wizard himself, but also because he is the son of a race of wizards. I have seen things that have blasted my soul. In the heart of the slumbering hills I have watched Zultotan commune with the souls of the damned, and invoke the ancient demons of forgotten Icheran. I have seen the accursed descendants of that accursed empire worship him and hail him as their archpriest. I have seen what he plots, and I tell you it is no less than the restoration of the ancient, black, grisly kingdom of Icheran." "What do you mean?" demanded Amalric. "Icheran is dust. There are not enough survivals to make an empire. Not even Zultotan can reshape the dust of 3,000 years. You know little of his black powers, answered Orestes grimly. I have seen the very hills take on an alien and ancient aspect under the spell of his incantations. I have glimpsed, like shadows behind the realities, the dim shapes and outlines of valleys, forests, mountains, and lakes that are not as they are today, but as they were in that dim yesterday, have even sensed, rather than glimpsed, the purple towers of forgotten Python shimmering like figures of mist in the dusk. And in the last conclave to which I accompanied him, understanding of his sorcery came to me at last, while the drums beat and the beast-like worshippers howled with their heads in the dust. I tell you he would restore Icharon by his magic, by the sorcery of a gigantic blood sacrifice such as the world has never seen. He would enslave the world, and with a deluge of blood wash away the present and restore the past. You are mad, exclaimed Tarascus. Mad. Orestes turned a haggard stare upon him. Can any man see what I have seen and remain wholly sane? Yet I speak the TNLTH. He plots the return of Icharon, with its towers and wizards, and kings and horrors, as it was in the long ago. The descendants of Icharon will serve him as a nucleus upon which to build, but it is the blood and the bodies of the people of the world today that will furnish the mortar and the stones for the rebuilding. I cannot tell you how. My own brain reels when I try to understand. But I have seen. Icharon will be Icharon again, and even the hills, the forests, and the rivers will resume their ancient aspect. Why not? If I, with my tiny store of knowledge, could bring to life a man dead 3,000 years, why cannot the greatest wizard of the world bring back to life a kingdom dead 3,000 years? Out of the dust shall Icharon arise at his bidding. How can we thwart him? Asked Tarascus, impressed. There is but one way, answered Orestes. We must steal the heart of Ahriman. But I, began Tarascus involuntarily, then closed his mouth quickly. None had noticed him, and Orestes was continuing. It is a power that can be used against him. With it in my hands I might defy him. But how shall we steal it? He has it hidden in some secret place, from which not even a Zamorian thief might filch it. I cannot learn its hiding place. If he would only sleep again the sleep of the Black Lotus, but the last time he slept thus was after the battle of the Valkyr, when he was weary because of the great magic he had performed, and, the door was locked and bolted, but it swung silently open and Sultotan stood before them, calm, tranquil, stroking his patriarchal beard, but the lambent lights of hell flickered in his eyes. I have taught you too much, he said calmly, pointing a finger like an index of doom at Orestes. And before any could move, he had cast a handful of dust on the floor near the feet of the priest, who stood like a man turned to marble. It flamed, smoldered, a blue serpentine of smoke rose and swayed upward about Orestes in a slender spiral. And when it had risen above his shoulders it curled about his neck, with a whipping suddenness like the stroke of a snake. Orestes' scream was choked to a gurgle. His hands flew to his neck, his eyes were distended, his tongue protruded. The smoke was like a blue rope about his neck, then it faded and was gone, and Orestes slumped to the floor a dead man. Sultotan smote his hands together and two men entered, men often observed accompanying him, small, repulsively dark, with red, oblique eyes and pointed, rat-like teeth. They did not speak. Lifting the corpse, they bore it away. Dismissing the matter with a wave of his hand, Sultotan seated himself at the ivory table about which sat the pale kings. Why are you in conclave? He demanded. The Aquilonians have risen in the west, answered Amalric, recovering from the grisly jolt the death of Orestes had given him. The fools believe that Conan is alive, and coming at the head of a Poetanian army to reclaim his kingdom. If he had reappeared immediately after Valkyr, or if an honor had been circulated that he lived, the central provinces would not have risen under him, they feared your powers so. But they have become so desperate under valorous misrule, that they are ready to follow any man who can unite them against us, and prefer sudden death to torture and continual misery. Of course the tale has lingered stubbornly in the land, that Conan was not really slain at Valkia, but not until recently have the masses accepted it. But Palantides is back from exile in Offa, swearing that the king was ill in his tent that day, and that a man-at-arms wore his harness, and a squire who but recently recovered from the stroke of a mace received at Valkia confirms his tale, or pretends to. An old woman with a pet wolf has wandered up and down the land, proclaiming that King Conan yet lives, and will return some day to reclaim the crown. And of late the cursed priests of Asura sing the same song. They claim that word has come to them by some mysterious means that Conan is returning to reconquer his domain. I cannot catch either her or them. This is, of course, a trick of Trucero's. My spies tell me there is indisputable evidence that the Poitanians are gathering to invade Aquilonia. I believe that Trucero will bring forward some pretender who he will claim is King Conan. Tarascus laughed, but there was no conviction in his laughter. He surreptitiously felt of a scar beneath his dew-horn, and remembered ravens that caught on the trail of a fugitive, remembered the body of his squire, Aridaeus, brought back from the border mountains horribly mangled by a great grey wolf, his terrified soldiers said. But he also remembered a red jewel stolen from a golden chest while a wizard slept, and he said nothing. And Valorous remembered a dying nobleman who gasped out a tale of fear, and he remembered 4 kittens who disappeared into the mazes of the south, and never returned. But he held his tongue, for hatred and suspicion of his allies ate at him like a worm, and he desired nothing so much as to see both rebels and Numidians go down locked in the death grip. But Amalric exclaimed, "It is absurd to dream that Conan lives." For answer Xaltotan cast a roll of parchment on the table. Amalric caught it up, glared at it. From his lips burst a furious, incoherent cry. He read, to Xaltotan, Grand Farker of Numidia, Dog of Icheran, I am returning to my kingdom, and I mean to hang your hide on a bramble. Conan. A forgery, exclaimed Amalric. Xaltotan shook his head. It is genuine. I have compared it with the signature on the royal documents on record in the libraries of the continent. None could imitate that bold scrawl. Then if Conan lives, muttered Amalric, this uprising will not be like the others, for he is the only man living who can unite the Aquilonians. But he protested, this is not like Conan. Why should he put us on our guard with his boasting? One would think that he would strike without warning, after the fashion of the barbarians. We are already warned, pointed out Xaltotan. Our spies have told us of preparations for war in Poitine. He could not cross the mountains without our knowledge, so he sends me his defiance in characteristic manner. Why to you? Demanded Valorous. Why not to me, or to Tarascus? Xaltotan turned his inscrutable gaze upon the king. Conan is wiser than you, he said at last. He already knows what you kings have yet to learn, that it is not Tarascus, nor Valorous, no, nor Amalric, but Xaltotan who is the real master of the western nations. They did not reply, they sat staring at him, assailed by a numbing realization of the truth of his assertion. There is no road for me but the imperial highway, said Xaltotan. But first we must crush Conan. I do not know how he escaped me at Belvis, for knowledge of what happened while I lay in the slumber of the Black Lotus is denied me. But he is in the south, gathering an army. It is his last, desperate blow, made possible only by the desperation of the people who have suffered under Valorous. Let them rise, I hold them all in the palm of my hand. We will wait until he moves against us, and then we will crush him once and for all. Then we shall see Msh Poitine, and Gundeland, and the stupid Bossonians. After them Offa, Argus, Zingara, Roth, all the nations of the world we shall weld into one vast empire. You shall rule as my satraps, and as my captains shall be greater than kings are now. I am unconquerable, for the heart of Ahriman is hidden where no man can ever wield it against me again. Tarascus averted his gaze, lest Xaltotan read his thoughts. He knew the wizard had not looked into the golden chest, with its carven serpents, that had seemed to sleep, since he laid the heart therein. Strange as it seemed, Zultotan did not know that the heart had been stolen. The strange jewel was beyond or outside the ring of his dark wisdom. His uncanny talents did not warn him that the chest was empty. Tarascus did not believe that Zultotan knew the full extent of Orest's revelations, for the Pythonian had not mentioned the restoration of Icheran, but only the building of a new, earthly empire. Tarascus did not believe that Zultotan was yet quite sure of his power. If they needed his aid in their ambitions, no less he needed theirs. Magic depended, to a certain extent after all, on sword strokes and lance thrusts. The king read meaning in Amalric's furtive glance. Let the wizard use his arts to help them defeat their most dangerous enemy. Time enough then to turn against him. There might yet be a way to cheat this dark power they had raised. 21. Drums of Peril. Confirmation of the war came when the army of Poitine, 10,000 strong, marched through the southern passes with waving banners and shimmer of steel. And at their head, the spies swore, rode a giant figure in black armor, with the royal lion of Aquilonia worked in gold upon the breast of his rich silken surcoat. Conan lived. The king lived. There was no doubt of it in men's minds now, whether friend or foe. With the news of the invasion from the south there also came word, brought by hard-riding couriers, that a host of gundermen was moving southward, reinforced by the barons of the northwest and the northern Bossonians. Tarascus marched with 31,000 men to Galbran, on the river Shirki, which the gundermen must cross to strike at the towns still held by the Numidians. The Shirki was a swift, turbulent river plunging southwestward through rocky gorges and canyons, and there were few places where an army could cross at that time of the year, when the stream was almost bank full with the melting of the snows. All the country east of the Shirki was in the hands of the Numidians, and it was logical to assume that the gundermen would attempt to cross either at Galbran, or at Tanajul, which lay to the south of Galbran. Reinforcements were daily expected from Numidia, until word came that the king of Offa was making hostile demonstrations on Numidia's southern border, and to spare any more troops would be to expose Numidia to the risk of an invasion from the south. Amalric and Valorous moved out from Turanshia with 25,000 men, leaving as large a garrison as they dared to discourage revolts in the cities during their absence. They wished to meet and crush Conan before he could be joined by the rebellious forces of the kingdom. The king and his Poitanians had crossed the mountains, but there had been no actual clash of arms, no attack on towns or fortresses. Conan had appeared and disappeared. Apparently he had tumbled westward through the wild, thinly settled hill country, and entered the Bossonian marches, gathering recruits as he went. Amalric and Valorous with their host, Numidians, Aquilonian renegades, and ferocious mercenaries, moved through the land in baffled wrath, looking for a foe which did not appear. Amalric found it impossible to obtain more than vague general tidings about Conan's movements. Scouting parties had a way of riding out and never returning, and it was not uncommon to find a spy calcified to an oak. The countryside was up and striking as peasants and country folk strike, savagely, murderously and secretly. All that Amalric knew certainly was that a large force of gundermen and northern Bossonians was somewhere to the north of him, beyond the Shirki, and that Conan with a smaller force of Poitanians and southern Bossonians was somewhere to the southwest of. He began to grow fearful that if he and Valorous advanced further into the wild country, Conan might elude them entirely, march around them and invade the central provinces behind them. Amalric fell back from the Shirki valley, and camped in a plain a day's ride from Tanajul. There he waited. Tarascus maintained his position at Galbran, for he feared that Conan's maneuvers were intended to draw him southward, and so let the gundermen into the kingdom at the Nonhem crossing. To Amalric's camp came Zultotan in his chariot drawn by the uncanny horses that never tired, and he entered Amalric's tent where the Baron conferred with Valorous over a map spread on an ivory camp table. This map Zultotan crumpled and flung aside. "What your scouts cannot learn for you," quoth he, "my spies tell me, though their information is strangely blurred and imperfect, as if unseen forces were working against me. Conan is advancing along the Shirki River with 10,000 Poitanians, 3,000 southern Bossonians, and barons of the west and south with retainers to the number of 5,000. An army of 30,000 gunmen and northern Bossonians is pushing southward to join him. They have established contact by means of secret communications used by the cursed priests of Asura, who seem to be opposing me, and whom I will feed to a serpent when the battle is over, I swear it by Set. Both armies are headed for the crossing at Tanajul, but I do not believe that the gunmen will cross the river. I believe that Conan will cross, instead, and join them. Why should Conan cross the river? Because it is to his advantage to delay the battle. The longer he waits, the stronger he will become, the more precarious our position. The hills on the other side of the river swarm with people passionately loyal to his cause, broken men, refugees, fugitives from valorous cruelty. From all over the kingdom men are hurrying to join his army, singly and by companies. Daily, parties from our armies are ambushed and cut to pieces by the country folk. Revolt grows in the central provinces, and will soon burst into open rebellion. The garrisons we left there are not sufficient, and we can hope for no reinforcements from Numidia for the time being. I see the hand of Palantides in this brawling on the off-iron frontier. He has kin in offer. If we do not catch and see Msh Conan quickly, the provinces will be in a blaze of revolt behind us. We shall have to fall back to Tarantia to defend what we have taken, and we may have to fight our way through a country in rebellion, with Conan's whole force at our heels, and then stand siege in the city itself, with enemies within as well as without. No, we cannot wait. We must crush Conan before his army grows too great, before the central provinces rise. With his head hanging above the gate, at Tarantia you will see how quickly the rebellion will fall apart. Why do you not put a spell on his army to slay them all? Asked Valorous, half in mockery. Zultotan stared at the Aquilonian, as if he read the full extent of the mocking madness that lurked in those wayward eyes. Do not worry, he said at last. My arts shall see N1 show Conan finally like a lizard under the heel. But even Source 1Y is aided by pikes and swords. If he crosses the river and takes up his position in the Goralian hills, he may be hard to dislodge, said Amalric. But if we catch him in the valley on this side of the river, we can wipe him out. How far is Conan from Tanajul? At the rate he is marching, he should reach the crossing sometime tomorrow night. His men are rugged and he is pushing them hard. He should arrive there at least a day before the gunmen. Good. Amalric smote the table with his clenched fist. I can reach Tanajul before he can. I'll send a rider to Tarascus, bidding him follow me to Tanajul. By the time he arrives I will have cut Conan off from the crossing and destroyed him. Then our combined force can cross the river and deal with the gunmen. Zultotan shook his head impatiently. A good enough plan if you were dealing with anyone but Conan. But your 25,000 men are not enough to destroy his 18,000 before the gunmen come up. They will fight with the desperation of wounded panthers. And suppose the gunmen come up while the hosts are locked in battle? You will be caught between two fires, and destroyed before Tarascus can arrive. He will reach Tanajul too late to aid you. What then? Demanded Amalric. Move with your whole strength against Conan, answered the man from Icheran. Send a rider bidding Tarascus join us here. We will wait his coming. Then we will march together to Tanajul. But while we wait, protested Amalric, Conan will cross the river and join the gunmen. Conan will not cross the river, answered Zultotan. Amalric's head jerked up and he stared into the cryptic dark eyes. What do you mean? Suppose there were torrential rains far to the north, at the head of the Shirki? Suppose the river came down in such flood as to render the crossing at Tanajul impassable? Could we not then bring up our entire force at our leisure, catch Conan on this side of the river, and crush him, And then, when the flood subsided, which I think it would do the next day, could we not cross the river, and destroy the gunmen? Thus we could use our full strength against each of these smaller forces in turn. Valorous laughed as he always laughed at the prospect of the ruin of either friend or foe, and drew a restless hand jerkily through his unruly yellow locks. Amalric stared at the man from Icheran with mingled fear and admiration. If we caught Conan in Shirky Valley, with the hill ridges to his right, and the river in flood to his left, he admitted, with our whole force we could annihilate him. Do you think, are you sure, do you believe such rains will fall? I go to my tent, answered Zultotan, rising. Necromancy is not accomplished by the waving of a wand. Send a rider to Tarascus. And let none approach my tent. That last command was unnecessary. No man in that host could have been bribed to approach that mysterious black silken pavilion, the door flaps of which were always closely drawn. None but Zultotan ever entered it, yet voices were often heard issuing from it, its walls billowed sometimes without a wind, and weird music came from it. Sometimes, deep in midnight, its silken walls were lit red by flames flickering within, limning misshapen silhouettes that passed to and fro. Lying in his own tent that night, Amalric heard the steady rumble of in Zultotan's tent. Through the darkness it boomed steadily, and occasionally the Nemedian could have sworn that a deep, croaking voice mingled with the pulse of the drum. And he shuddered, for he knew that voice was not the voice of Zultotan. The drum muzzled and muttered on like deep thunder, heard afar off, and before dawn Amalric, glancing from his tent, caught the red flicker of lightning afar on the northern horizon. In all other parts of the sky the great stars blazed whitely. But the distant lightning flickered incessantly, like the crimson glint of firelight on a tiny, tumbling blade. At sunset of the next day Tarascus came up with his host, dusty and weary from hard marching, the footmen straggling hours behind the horsemen. They camped in the plain near Amalric's camp, and at dawn the combined army moved westward. Ahead of him roved a swarm of scouts, and Amalric waited impatiently for them to return and tell of the Poitanians trapped beside a furious flood. But when the scouts met the column it was with the news that Conan had crossed the river. What? Exclaimed Amalric. Did he cross before the flood? There was no flood, answered the scouts, puzzled. Late last night he came up to Tanajal and flung his army across. No flood, exclaimed Zultotan, taken aback for the first time in Amalric's knowledge. Impossible. There were mighty rains upon the headwaters of the Shirky last night, and the night before that. That may be, your lordship, answered the scout. It is true the water was muddy, and the people of Tanajal said that the river rose perhaps a foot yesterday, but that was not enough to prevent Conan's crossing. Zultotan's sorcery had failed. The thought hammered in Amalric's brain. His horror of this strange man out of the past had grown steadily since that night in Belvis, when he had seen a brown, shriveled mummy swell and grow into a living man. And the death of Orestes had changed lurking horror into active fear. In his heart was a grisly conviction that the man, or devil, was invincible. Yet now he had undeniable proof of his failure. Yet even the greatest of necromancers might fail occasionally, thought the Baron. At any rate, he dared not oppose the man from Icheran, yet. Orestes was dead, writhing in Mitra only knew what nameless hell, and Amalric knew his sword would scarcely prevail where the black wisdom of the renegade priest had failed. What grisly abominations Zultotan plotted lay in the unpredictable future. Conan and his host were a present menace against which Zultotan's wizardry might well be needed before the play was all played. They came to Tanajal, a small fortified village, at the spot where a reef of rocks made a natural bridge across the river, passable always except in times of greatest flood. Scouts brought in the news that Conan had taken up his position in the Goralian hills, which began to rise a few miles beyond the river. And just before sundown the gunman had arrived in his camp. Amalric looked at Zultotan, inscrutable and alien in the light of the flaring torches. Night had fallen. What now? Your magic has failed. Conan confronts us with an army nearly as strong as our own, and he has the advantage of position. We have a choice of two evils, to camp here and await his attack, or to fall back toward Turanshia and await reinforcements. We are mind if we wait, answered Zultotan. Cross the river and camp on the plain. We will attack at dawn. But his position is too strong, exclaimed Amalric. Fool! A gust of passion broke the veneer of the wizard's calm. Have you forgotten Valkyr? Because some obscure elemental principle prevented the flood, do you deem me helpless? I had intended that your spears should exterminate our enemies, but do not fear, it is my arts that shall see NLSH their host. Conan is in a trap. He will never see another sunset. Cross the river. They crossed by the flare of torches. The hoofs of the horses clinked on the rocky bridge, splashed through the shallows. The glint of the torches on shields and breastplates was reflected redly in the black water. The rock bridge was broad on which they crossed, but even so it was past midnight before the host was camped in the plain beyond. Above them they could see fires winking redly in the distance. Conan had turned at bay in the Goralian hills, which had more than once before served as the last stand of an Aquilonian king. Amalric left his pavilion, and strode restlessly through the camp. A weird glow flickered in Zultotan's tent, and from time to time a demoniacal cry slashed the silence, and there was a low sinister muttering of Adnan, that rustled rather than rumbled. Amalric, his instincts whetted by the night, and the circumstances, felt that Zultotan was opposed by more than physical force. Doubts of the wizard's power assailed him. He glanced at the fires high above him, and his face set in grim lines. He and his army were deep in the midst of a hostile country. Up there among those hills lurked thousands of wolfish figures out of whose hearts and souls all emotion and hope had been scourged except a frenzied hate for their conquerors, a mad lust for vengeance. Defeat meant annihilation, retreat through a land swarming with blood-mad enemies. And on the morrow he must hurl his host against the grimmest fighter in the western nations, and his desperate horde. If Zultotan failed them now, half a dozen men-at-arms strode out of the shadows. The firelight glinted on their breastplates and helmet crests. Among them they half led, half dragged a gaunt figure in tattered rags. Saluting, they spoke, "My lord, this man came to the outposts and said he desired word with King Valorous. He is an Aquilonian. He looked more like a wolf the traps had scarred. Old sores that only fetters make showed on his wrists and ankles. A great brand, the mark of hot iron, disfigured his face. His eyes glared through the tangle of his matted hair as he half crouched before the Baron. "Who are you, you filthy dog?" demanded the Nemedian. "Call me Tiberius," answered the man, and his teeth clicked in an involuntary spasm. "I'll have come to tell you how to trap Conan." "A traitor, eh?" bled the Baron. "Men say you have gold," mouthed the man, shivering under his rags. "Give some to me. Give me gold and I will show you how to defeat the king." His eyes glazed widely, his outstretched, up-tuned hands were spread like quivering claws. Amalric shnlgged his shoulder in distaste. But no tool was too base for his use. "If you speak the TNRTH you shall have more gold than you can carry," he said. "If you are a liar and a spy I will have you calcified head down. Bring him along." In the tent of Valorous, the Baron pointed to the man who crouched shivering before them, huddling his rags about him. "He says he knows a way to aid us on the morrow." "We will need aid, if Zultotan's plan is no better than it has proved so far." "Speak on, dog." The man's body writhed in strange convulsions. Words came in a stumbling rush. "Conan camps at the head of the Valley of Lions. It is shaped like a fan, with steep hills on either side. If you attack him tomorrow you will have to march straight up the valley. You cannot climb the hills on either side. But if King Valorous will deign to accept my service, I will guide him through the hills, and show him how he can come upon King Conan from behind. But if it is to be done at all, we must start soon. It is many hours riding, for one must go miles to the west, then miles to the north, then turn eastward and so come into the Valley of Lions from behind, as the gunderman came. Amalric hesitated, tugging his chin. In these chaotic times it was not rare to find men willing to sell their souls for a few gold pieces. "If you lead me astray you will die," said Valorous. "You are aware of that, are you not?" The man shivered, but his wide eyes did not waver. "If I betray you, slay me." "Conan will not dare divide his force," mused Amalric. "He will need all his men to repel our attack. He cannot spare any to lay ambushes in the hills. Besides, this fellow knows his hide depends on his leading you as he promised. Would a dog like him sacrifice himself? Nonsense. No, Valorous, I believe the man is honest. Or a greater thief than most, for he would sell his liberator," laughed Valorous. "Very well. I will follow the dog. How many men can you spare me?" 5,000 should be enough," answered Amalric. "A surprise attack on their rear will throw them into confusion, and that will be enough. I shall expect your attack about noon." "You will know when I strike," answered Valorous. As Amalric returned to his pavilion he noted with gratification that Xototan was still in his tent, to judge from the blood-freezing cries that shuddered forth into the night air from time to time. When presently he heard the clink of steel and the jingle of bridles in the outer darkness, he smiled grimly. Valorous had about served his purpose. The Baron knew that Conan was like a wounded lion that rends and tears even in his death throes. When Valorous struck from the rear, the desperate strokes of the Cimmerian might well wipe his rival out of existence before he himself succumbed. So much the better. Amalric felt he could well dispense with Valorous, once he had paved the way for an immediate victory. The 5,000 horsemen who accompanied Valorous were hard-beaten Aquilonian renegades for the most part. In the still starlight they moved out of the sleeping camp, following the westward trend of the great black masses that rose against the stars ahead of them. Valorous rode at their head, and beside him rode Tiberius, a leather thong about his wrist gripped by a man-at-arms who rode on the other side of him. Others kept close behind with drawn swords. "Play us false and you die instantly," Valorous pointed out. "I do not know every sheep path in these hills, but I know enough about the general configuration of the country to know the directions we must take to come in behind the Valley of Lions. See that you do not lead us astray." The man ducked his head and his teeth chattered as he volubly assured his captor of his loyalty, staring up stupidly at the banner that floated over him, the golden serpent of the old dynasty. Skirting the extremities of the hills that locked the Valley of Lions, they swung wide to the west. An hour's ride and they turned non, forging through wild and rugged hills, following dim trails and tortuous paths. Sunrise found them some miles northwest of Conan's position, and here the guide turned eastward and led them through a maze of labyrinths and crags. Valorous nodded, judging their position by various peaks thrusting up above the others. He had kept his bearings in a general way, and he knew they were still headed in the right direction. But now, without warning, a grey fleecy mass came billowing down from the non, veiling the slopes, spreading out through the valleys. It blotted out the sun, the world became a blind grey void in which visibility was limited to a matter of yards. Advance became a stumbling, groping muddle. Valorous cursed. He could no longer see the peaks that had served him as guideposts. He must depend wholly upon the traitorous guide. The golden serpent drooped in the windless air. Presently Tiberius seemed himself confused. He halted, stared about uncertainly. "Are you lost, dog?" demanded Valorous harshly. "Listen." Somewhere ahead of them a faint vibration began, the rhythmic numble of a Conan's drum, exclaimed the Aquilonian. "If we are close enough to hear the drum," said Valorous, Why do we not hear the shouts, and the clang of arms? Surely battle has joined? The gorges and the winds play strange tricks, answered Tiberius, his teeth chattering with the ague that is frequently the lot of men who have spent much time in damp underground dungeons. Listen. Faintly to their ears came a low muffled roar. They are fighting down in the valley, cried Tiberius. The sim is beating on the heights. Let us hasten. He rode straight on toward the sound of the distant drum, as one who knows his ground at last. Valorous followed, cursing the fog. Then it occurred to him that it would mask his advance. Conan could not see him coming. He would be at the Cimmerian's back before the noonday sun dispelled the mists. Just now he could not tell what lay on either hand, whether cliffs, thickets or gorges. The chum throbbed unceasingly, growing louder as they advanced, but they heard no more of the battle. Valorous had no idea toward what point of the compass they were headed. He stand as he saw grey rock walls looming through the smoky drifts on either hand, and realized that they were riding through a narrow defile. But the guide showed no sign of nervousness, and Valorous hove a sigh of relief when the walls widened out and became invisible in the fog. They were through the defile. If an ambush had been planned, it would have been made in that pass. But now Tiberius halted again. The chum was mumbling louder, and Valorous could not determine from what direction the sound was coming. Now it seemed ahead of him, now behind, now on one hand or the other. Valorous glared about him impatiently, sitting on his war-horse with wisps of mist curling about him and the moisture gleaming on his armor. Behind him the long lines of steel-clad riders faded away and away like phantoms into the mist. "Why do you tarry, dog?" he demanded. The man seemed to be listening to the ghostly glum. Slowly he straightened in his saddle, turned his head and faced Valorous, and the smile on his lips was terrible to see. "The fog is thinning, Valorous," he said in a new voice, pointing a bony finger. "Look." The drum was silent. The fog was fading away. First the crests of cliffs came in sight above the grey clouds, tall and spectral. Lower and lower crawled the mists, shrinking, fading. Valorous started up in his stirrups, with a cry that the horsemen echoed behind him. On all sides of them the cliffs towered. They were not in a wide, open valley as he had supposed. They were in a blind gorge walled by sheer cliffs hundreds of feet high. The only entrance or exit was that narrow defile through which they had ridden. "Dog!" Valorous struck Tiberius full in the mouth with his clenched mailed hand. "What devil's trick is this?" Tiberius spat out a mouthful of blood, and shook with fearful laughter. "A trick that shall rid the world of a beast." "Look, dog!" Again Valorous cried out, more in folly than in fear. The defile was blocked by a wild and terrible band of men who stood silent as images, ragged, shock-headed men with spears in their hands, hundreds of them. And up on the cliffs appeared other faces, thousands of faces, wild, gaunt, ferocious faces, marked by fire and steel and starvation. "A trick of Conan's," raged Valorous. "Conan knows nothing of it," laughed Tiberius. "It was the plot of broken men, of men you mined and turned to beasts. I see was right. Conan has not divided his army. We are the rabble who followed him, the wolves who skulked in these hills, the homeless men, the hopeless men. This was our plan, and the priests of Asura aided us with their mist. Look at them, Valorous. Each bears the mark of your hand, on his body or on his heart. Look at me. You do not know me, do you? What of this scar your hangman burned upon me? Once you knew me. Once I was lord of Amilius, the man whose sons you murdered, whose daughter your mercenaries ravished and slew. You said I would not sacrifice myself to trap you? Almighty gods, if I had 1,000 lives I would give them all to buy your doom. And I have bought it. Look on the men you broke, dead men who once played the king. Their hour has come. This gorge is your tomb. Try to climb the cliffs, they are steep, they are high. Try to fight your way back through the defile, spears will block your path, boulders will crush you from above. Dog. I will be waiting for you in hell. Throwing back his head, he laughed until the rocks rang. Valorous leaned from his saddle, and slashed down with his great sword, severing shoulder, bone and breast. Tiberius sank to the earth, still laughing ghastly through a gurgle of gushing blood. The drums had begun again, encircling the gorge with guttural thunder, boulders came crashing down, above the screams of dying men shrilled the arrows in blinding clouds from the cliffs. 22. The road to Icheron. Dawn was just whitening the east, when Amalric drew up his hosts in the mouth of the Valley of Lions. This valley was flanked by low, rolling but steep hills, and the floor pitched upward in a series of irregular natural terraces. On the uppermost of these terraces Conan's army held its position, awaiting the attack. The host that had joined him, marching down from Gunderland, had not been composed exclusively of spearmen. With them had come 7,000 Bossonian archers, and 4,000 barons and their retainers of the Non and West, swelling the ranks of his cavalry. The pikesmen were drawn up in a compact wedge-shaped formation at the narrow head of the valley. There were 19,000 of them, mostly gundermen, though some 4,000 were Aquilonians of other provinces. They were flanked on either hand by 5,000 Bossonian archers. Behind the ranks of the pikesmen the knights sat their steeds motionless, lances raised, 10,000 knights of Poitine, 9,000 Aquilonians, barons, and their retainers. It was a strong position. His flanks could not be tumbled, for that would mean climbing the steep, wooded hills in the teeth of the arrows and swords of the Bossonians. His camp lay directly behind him, in a narrow, steep-walled valley which was indeed merely a continuation of the Valley of Lions, pitching up at a higher level. He did not fear surprise from the rear, because the hills behind him were full of refugees and broken men whose loyalty to him was beyond question. But if his position was hard to shake, it was equally hard to escape from. It was a trap as well as a fortress for the defenders, a desperate last stand of men who did not expect to survive unless they were victorious. The only line of retreat possible was through the narrow valley. At their rear Zultotan mounted a hill on the left side of the valley, near the wide mouth. This hill rose higher than the others, and was known as the King's Altar, for a reason long forgotten. Only Zultotan knew, and his memory dated back 3,000 years. He was not alone. His two familiars, silent, hairy, furtive and dark, were with him, and they bore a young Aquilonian girl, bound hand and foot. They laid her on an ancient stone, which was curiously like an altar, and which crowned the summit of the hill. For long centuries it had stood there, worn by the elements until many doubted that it was anything but a curiously shapen natural rock. But what it was, and why it stood there, Zultotan remembered from of old. The familiars went away, with their bent backs like silent gnomes, and Zultotan stood alone beside the altar, his dark beard blown in the wind, overlooking the valley. He could see clear back to the winding Shirki, and up into the hills beyond the head of the valley. He could see the gleaming wedge of steel drawn up at the head of the terraces, the berganets of the archers glinting among the rocks and bushes, the silent knights motionless on their steeds, their pennons flowing above their helmets, their lances rising in a bristling thicket. Looking in the other direction he could see the long serried lines of the Numidians moving in ranks of shining steel into the mouth of the valley. Behind them the gay pavilions of the lords and knights and the drab tents of the common soldiers stretched back almost to the river. Like a river of molten steel the Numidian host flowed into the valley, the great scarlet dragon rippling over it. First marched the bowmen, in even ranks, arbalists half raised, bolts knocked, fingers on triggers. After them came the pikesmen, and behind them the real strength of the army, the mounted knights, their banners unfurled to the wind, their lances lifted, walking their great steeds forward as if they rode to a banquet. And higher up on the slopes the smaller Aquilonian host stood grimly silent. There were 30,000 Numidian knights, and, as in most Hyborian nations, it was the chivalry which was the sword of the army. The footmen were used only to clear the way for a charge of the armored knights. There were 21,000 of these, pikesmen and archers. The bowmen began loosing as they advanced, without breaking ranks, launching their quarrels with ahwa and tang. But the bolts fell short or rattled harmlessly from the overlapping shields of the gundermen. And before the arbalisters could come within killing range, the arching shafts of the Bossonians were wreaking havoc in their ranks. A little of this, a futile attempt at exchanging fire, and the Numidian bowmen began falling back in disorder. Their armor was light, their weapons no match for the Bossonian longbows. The western archers were sheltered by bushes and rocks. Moreover, the Numidian footmen lacked something of the morale of the horsemen, knowing as they did that they were being used merely to clear the way for the knights. The crossbowmen fell back, and between their opening lines the pikesmen advanced. These were largely mercenaries, and their masters had no compunction about sacrificing them. They were intended to mask the advance of the knights until the latter were within smiting distance. So while the arbalisters plied their bolts from either flank at long range, the pikesmen marched into the teeth of the blast from above, and behind them the knights came on. When the pikesmen began to falter beneath the savage hail of death that whistled down the slopes among them, a trumpet blew, their companies divided to right and left, and through them the mailed knights thundered. They ran full into a cloud of stinging death. The clothiard shafts found every crevice in their armor, and the housings of the steeds. Horses scrambling up the grassy terraces reared and plunged backward, bearing their riders with them. Steel-clad forms littered the slopes. The charge wavered and ebbed back. Back down in the valley Amalric reformed his ranks. Tarascus was fighting with drawn sword under the Scarlet Dragon, but it was the Baron of Tor who commanded that day. Amalric swore as he glanced at the forest of lance tips visible above and beyond the headpieces of the gundermen. He had hoped his retirement would draw the knights out in a charge down the slopes after him, to be raked from either flank by his bowmen and swamped by the numbers of his horsemen. But they had not moved. Camp servants brought skins of water from the river. Knights doffed their helmets and drenched their sweating heads. The wounded on the slopes screamed vainly for water. In the upper valley, springs supplied the defenders. They did not thirst that long, hot spring day. On the king's altar, beside the ancient, carven stone, Zultotan watched the steel tide ebb and flow. On came the knights, with waving plumes and dipping lances. Through a whistling cloud of arrows they plowed to break like a thundering wave on the bristling wall of spears and shields. Axes rose and fell above the plumed helmets, spears thnst upward, bringing down horses and riders. The pride of the gundermen was no less fierce than that of the knights. They were not spear fodder, to be sacrificed for the glow of better men. They were the finest infant in the world, with a tradition that made their morale unshakable. The kings of Aquilonia had long learned the worth of unbreakable infantry. They held their formation unshaken, over their gleaming ranks flowed the great lion banner, and at the tip of the wedge a giant figure in black armor roared and smote like a hurricane, with a dripping axe that split steel and bone alike. The Numidians fought as gallantly as their traditions of high courage demanded. But they could not break the iron wedge, and from the wooded knolls on either hand arrows raked their close-packed ranks mercilessly. Their own bowmen were useless, their pikesmen unable to climb the heights and come to grips with the Bossonians. Slowly, stubbornly, sullenly, the grim knights fell back, counting their empty saddles. Above them the gundermen made no outcry of triumph. They closed their ranks, locking up the gaps made by the fallen. Sweat ran into their eyes from under their steel caps. They gripped their spears and waited, their fierce hearts swelling with pride that a king should fight on foot with them. Behind them the Aquilonian knights had not moved. They sat their steeds, grimly immobile. A knight spurred a sweating horse up the hill called the King's Altar, and glared at Zultotan with bitter eyes. "Amalric bids me say that it is time to use your magic, wizard," he said. "We are dying like flies down there in the valley. We cannot break their ranks." Zultotan seemed to expand, to grow tall and awesome and terrible. "Return to Amalric," he said. "Tell him to reform his ranks for a charge, but to await my signal. Before that signal is given he will see a sight that he will remember until he lies dying." The knight saluted as if compelled against his will, and thundered down the hill at breakneck pace. Zultotan stood beside the dark altar stone and stared across the valley, at the dead and wounded men on the terraces, at the grim, blood-stained band at the head of the slopes, at the dusty, steel-clad ranks reforming in the vale below. He glanced up at the sky, and he glanced down at the slim white figure on the dark stone. And lifting a dagger inlaid with archaic hieroglyphs, he intoned an immemorial invocation, "Set, God of darkness, scaly Lord of the shadows, by the blood of a virgin, and the sevenfold symbol I called to your sons below the black earth. Children of the deeps, below the red earth, under the black earth, awaken and shake your awful manes. Let the hills rock and the stones topple upon my enemies. Let the sky grow dark above them, the earth unstable beneath their feet. Let a wind from the deep black earth curl up beneath their feet, and blacken and shrivel them." He halted short, dagger lifted. In the tense silence the roar of the hosts rose beneath him, borne on the wind. On the other side of the altar stood a man in a black hooded robe, whose coif shadowed pale delicate features, and dark eyes calm and meditative. "Dog of Asura," whispered Zultotan, his voice was like the hiss of an angered serpent. "Are you mad, that you seek your doom? Ho, Baal! Chiron! Call again, dog of Icheran," said the other, and laughed. "Summon them loudly. They will not hear, unless your shouts reverberate in hell." From a thicket on the edge of the crest came a sombre old woman in peasant garb, her hair flowing over her shoulders, a great grey wolf following at her heels. "Witch, priest, and wolf," muttered Zultotan grimly, and laughed. "Fools, to pit your charlatans mum you against my arts. With a wave of my hand I banish you from my path." "Your arts are straws in the wind, dog of Python," answered the Assyrian. "Have you wondered why the Shurkid did not come down in flood, and trap Conan on the other bank? When I saw the lightning in the night I guessed your plan, and my spells dispersed the clouds you had summoned before they could empty their torrents. You did not even know that your rain-making wizardry had failed." "You lie," cried Zultotan, but the confidence in his voice was shaken. "I'll have felt the impact of a powerful sorcery against mine, but no man on earth could undo the rain magic, once made, unless he possessed the very heart of sorcery." "But the flood you plotted did not come to pass," answered the priest. "Look at your allies in the valley, Pythonian. You have led them to the slaughter. They are caught in the fangs of the trap, and you cannot aid them. Look." He pointed. Out of the narrow gorge of the upper valley, behind the Poitanians, a horseman came flying, whirling something about his head that flashed in the sun. Recklessly he hurtled down the slopes, through the ranks of the gunmen, who sent up a deep-throated roar, and clashed their spears and shields like thunder in the hills. On the terraces between the hosts the sweat-soaked horse reared and plunged, and his wild rider yelled and brandished the thing in his hands like one demented. It was the torn remnant of a scarlet banner, and the sun struck dazzlingly on the golden scales of a serpent that writhed thereon. "Valorous is dead," cried Hadrathus ringingly. "A fog and a DNNN lured him to his doom. I gathered that fog, dog of Python, and I dispersed it. I, with my magic which is greater than your magic." "What matters it?" roared Zultotan, a terrible sight, his eyes blazing, his features convulsed. "Valorous was a fool. I do not need him. I can crush Conan without human aid." "Why have you delayed?" mocked Hadrathus. "Why have you allowed so many of your allies to fall pierced by arrows, and spitted on spears? Because blood aids great sorcery, thundered Xototan, in a voice that made the rocks quiver. A lurid nimbus played about his awful head. Because no wizard wastes his strength thoughtlessly. Because I would conserve my powers for the great days to be, rather than employ them in a hill country brawl. But now, by Set, I shall loose them to the uttermost. Watch, dog of Asura, false priest of an outworn god, and see a sight that shall blast your reason for evermore. Hadrathas threw back his head and laughed, and hell was in his laughter. Look, black devil of Python. His hand came from under his robe holding something that flamed and burned in the sun, changing the light to a pulsing golden glow in which the flesh of Xototan looked like the flesh of a corpse. Xototan cried out as if he had been stabbed. The heart. The heart of Ahriman. I. The one power that is greater than your power. Xototan seemed to shrivel, to grow old. Suddenly his beard was shot with snow, his locks flecked with grey. The heart, he mumbled. You stole it. Dog. Thief. Not El. It has been on a long journey far to the southward. But now it is in my hands, and your black arts cannot stand against it. As it resurrected you, so shall it hurl you back into the night whence it drew you. You shall go down the dark road to Icheran, which is the road of silence, and the night. The Dark Empire, unreborn, shall remain a legend and a black memory. Conan shall reign again. And the Heian of Ahriman shall go back into the cavern below the temple of Mitra, to burn as a symbol of the power of Aquilonia for 1,000 years. Xototan screamed inhumanly and nshed around the altar, dagger lifted, but from somewhere, out of the sky, perhaps, or the great jewel that blazed in the hand of Hadrathas, shot a jetting beam of blinding blue light. Full against the breast of Xototan it flashed, and the hills re-echoed the concussion. The wizard of Icheran went down as though struck by a thunderbolt, and before he touched the ground he was fearfully altered. Beside the altar stone lay no fresh slain corpse, but a shriveled mummy, a brown, dry, unrecognizable carcass sprawling among moulding swathings. Somberly old Zelata looked down. He was not a living man, she said. The heart lent him a false aspect of life, that deceived even himself. I never saw him as other than a mummy. Hadrathas bent to unbind the swooning girl on the altar, when from among the trees appeared a strange apparition, Xototan's chariot drawn by the weird horses. Silently they advanced to the altar and halted, with the chariot wheel almost touching the brown withered thing on the grass. Hadrathas lifted the body of the wizard and placed it in the chariot. And without hesitation the uncanny steeds turned and moved off southward, down the hill. And Hadrathas and Zelata and the grey wolf watched them go, down the long road to Icheran which is beyond the ken of men. Down in the valley Amalric had stiffened in his saddle when he saw that wild horseman curvetting and caracoling on the slopes while he brandished that blood-stained serpent banner. Then some instinct jerked his head about, toward the hill known as the King's Altar. And his lips parted. Every man in the valley saw it, an arching shaft of dazzling light that towered up from the summit of the hill, showering golden fire. High above the hosts it burst in a blinding blaze that momentarily paled the sun. That's not Xototan's signal, roared the Baron. No, shouted Tarascus. It's a signal to the Aquilonians. Look. Above them the immobile ranks were moving at last, and a deep-throated roar thundered across the vale. Xototan has failed us, bellowed Amalric furiously. Valorous has failed us. We have been led into a trap. Mitra's curse on Xototan who led us here. Sound the retreat. Too late, yelled Tarascus. Look up on the slopes the forest of lancers dipped, leveled. The ranks of the gunmen rolled back to right and left like a parting curtain. And with a thunder like the rising roar of a hurricane, the knights of Aquilonia crashed down the slopes. The impetus of that charge was irresistible. Bolts driven by the demoralized arbalisters glanced from their shields, their bent helmets. Their plumes and pennons streaming out behind them, their lances lowered, they swept over the wavering lines of pikesmen, and roared down the slopes like a wave. Amalric yelled an order to charge, and the Numidians with desperate courage spurred their horses at the slopes. They still outnumbered the attackers. But they were weary men on tired horses, charging uphill. The onrushing knights had not STNLCK a blow that day. Their horses were fresh. They were coming downhill, and they came like a thunderbolt. And like a thunderbolt they smote the struggling ranks of the Numidians, smote them, split them apart, ripped them asunder, and dashed the remnants headlong down the slopes. After them on foot came the Gundermen, blood-mad, and the Bossonians were swarming down the hills, loosing as they ran at every foe that still moved. Down the slopes washed the tide of battle, the dazed Numidians swept on the crest of the wave. Their archers had thrown down their arbalists, and were fleeing. Such pikesmen as had survived the blasting charge of the knights were cut to pieces by the ruthless Gundermen. In a wild confusion the battles swept through the wide mouth of the valley, and into the plain beyond. All over the plain swarmed the warriors, fleeing and pursuing, broken into single combat, and clumps of smiting, hacking knights on rearing, wheeling horses. But the Numidians were smashed, broken, unable to reform or make a stand. By the hundreds they broke away, spurring for the river. Many reached it, rushed across and rode eastward. The Count side was up behind them, the people hunted them like wolves. Few ever reached Turantia. The final break did not come until the fall of Amalric. The Baron, striving in vain to rally his men, rode straight at the clump of knights that followed the giant in black armor, whose surcoat bore the royal lion, and over whose head floated the golden lion banner with the scarlet leopard of Poitine beside it. A tall warrior in gleaming armor couched his lance, and charged to meet the Lord of Tor. They met like a thunderclap. The Numidian's lance, striking his foe's helmet, snapped bolts and rivets and tore off the casque, revealing the features of Palantids. But the Aquilonian's lance head crashed through shield and breastplate to transfix the Baron's heart. A roar went up as Amalric was hurled from his saddle, snapping the lance that impaled him, and the Numidians gave way, as a barrier bursts under the surging impact of a tidal wave. They rode for the river in a blind stampede that swept the plain like a whirlwind. The hour of the dragon had passed. Tarascus did not flee. Amalric was dead, the color-bearer slain, and the royal Numidian banner trampled in the blood and dust. Most of his knights were fleeing, and the Aquilonians were riding them down. Tarascus knew the day was lost, but with a handful of faithful followers he raged through the melee, conscious of but one desire, to meet Conan, the Cimmerian. And at last he met him. Formations had been destroyed utterly, close-knit bands broken asunder and swept apart. The crest of Trusero gleamed in one part of the plain, those of Prospero and Palantids in others. Conan was alone. The house troops of Tarascus had fallen one by one. The two kings met man to man. Even as they rode at each other, the horse of Tarascus sobbed and sank under him. Conan leaped from his own steed, and ran at him, as the king of Numidia disengaged himself and rose. Steel flashed blindingly in the sun, clashed loudly, and blue sparks flew, then a clang of armor as Tarascus measured his full length on the earth beneath a thunderous stroke of Conan's broadsword. The Cimmerian placed a mail-shod foot on his enemy's breast, and lifted his sword. His helmet was gone, he shook back his black mane, and his blue eyes blazed with their old fire. "Do you yield? Will you give me quarter?" demanded the Numidian. "Aye. Better than you'd have given me, you dog. Life for you and all your men who throw down their arms. Though I ought to split your head for an infernal thief," the Cimmerian added. Tarascus twisted his neck, and glared over the plain. The remnants of the Numidian host were flying across the stone bridge, with swarms of victorious Aquilonians at their heels, smiting with fury of glutted vengeance. Bossonians and Gundermen were swarming through the camp of their enemies, tearing the tents to pieces in search of plunder, seizing prisoners, ripping open the baggage, and upsetting the wagons. Tarascus cursed fervently, and then shrugged his shoulders, as well as he could, under the circumstances. Very well. I have no choice. What are your demands? Surrender to me all your present holdings in Aquilonia. Order your garrisons to march out of the castles and towns they hold, without their arms, and get your infernal armies out of Aquilonia as quickly as possible. In addition, you shall return all Aquilonians sold as slaves, and pay an indemnity to be designated later, when the damage your occupation of the country has caused has been properly estimated. You will remain as hostage until these terms have been carried out. Very well, surrendered Tarascus. 6 will surrender all the castles and towns now held by my garrisons without resistance, and all the other things shall be done. What ransom for my body? Conan laughed and removed his foot from his foe's steel-clad breast, grasped his shoulder and heaved him to his feet. He started to speak, then turned to see Hadrathas approaching him. The priest was as calm and self-possessed as ever, picking his way between rows of dead men and horses. Conan wiped the sweat-smeared dust from his face with a blood-stained hand. He had fought all through the day, first on foot with a pikesman, then in the saddle, leading the charge. His surcoat was gone, his armor splashed with blood and battered with strokes of sword, mace, and axe. He loomed gigantically against a background of blood and slaughter, like some grim pagan hero of mythology. Well done, Hadrathas, quoth he gustily. By Crom, I am glad to see your signal. My knights were almost mad with impatience, and eating their hearts out to be at sword strokes. I could not have held them much longer. What of the wizard? He has gone down the dim road to Icheran, answered Hadrathas. And I am for Tarantia. My work is done here, and I have a task to perform at the temple of Mitra. All our work is done here. On this field we have saved Aquilonia, and more than Aquilonia. Your ride to your capital will be a triumphal procession through a kingdom mad with joy. All Aquilonia will be cheering the return of their king. And so, until we meet again in the great royal hall, farewell. Conan stood silently watching the priest as he went. From various parts of the field knights were hurrying toward him. He saw Palantids, Trusero, Prospero, Servius Gallinus, their armor splashed with crimson. The thunder of battle was giving way to a roar of triumph and acclaim. All eyes, hot with strife and shining with exultation, were turned toward the great black figure of the king, mailed arms brandished red-stained swords. A confused torrent of sound rose, deep and thunderous as the sea surf. Well, Conan, king of Aquilonia. Tarascus spoke. You have not yet named my ransom. Conan laughed and slapped his sword home in its scabbard. He flexed his mighty arms, and ran his blood-stained fingers through his thick black locks, as if feeling there his re-won crown. There is a girl in your seraglio named Zenobia. Why, yes, so there is. Very well. The king smiled as at an exceedingly pleasant memory. She shall be your ransom, and naught else. I will come to Belvas for her as I promised. She was a slave in Numidia, but I will make her queen of Aquilonia. The end.